The Emperor's Ring, a Feluda Adventure by Satyajit Roy. I was at first quite disappointed when I heard Baba say, "Let's have a holiday in Lucknow this year." Dhiru has been asking us for a long time to go and visit him. It was my belief that Lucknow was dull and boring. Baba did say we'd include a trip to Haridwar and Lakshman Jhula, and the latter was in the hills, but that would be just for a few days. We generally went to either Darjeeling or Puri. I liked both the sea and the mountains. Lucknow had neither. So I said to Baba, "Couldn't we ask Feluda to come with us?" Feluda has a theory about himself. No matter where he goes, he says, mysterious things start happening around him. And true enough, the last time he went with us to Darjeeling, all those strange things happened to Rajan Babu. If Lucknow could offer something similar, it wouldn't matter too much if the place itself was boring. Baba said, "Felu would be most welcome, but can he get away?" Feluda appeared quite enthusiastic when I told him. "Went there in 1958 to play a cricket match," he said. "It's not a bad place at all. If you went inside the Bulbulaya in the Barai Mambara, I'm sure your eyes would pop out. What an imagination those Nawabs had. My God." "You'll get leave, won't you?" Feluda ignored my question and continued to speak. "And it's not just the Bulbulaya. You'll get to see the monkey bridge over the Gomti, and of course the battered residency." "What's the residency?" "It was the center of the British forces during the mutiny. They couldn't do a thing. The sepoys tore it apart." Feluda had been at his job for 2 years. Since he hadn't taken any leave in the first year, it wasn't difficult for him now to get a couple of weeks off. Perhaps I should explain here that Feluda is my cousin. I'm 14 and he's 27. Some people think him crazy, some say he's only eccentric, others call him just plain lazy. But I happen to know that few men of his age possess his intelligence. And if he finds a job that interests him, he can work harder than anyone I know. Besides, he's good at cricket, knows at least 100 indoor games, a number of card tricks, a little hypnotism, and can write with both hands. When he was in school, his memory was so good that he has memorized every word in Tagore's Snatched from the Gods after just 2 readings. But what is most remarkable about Feluda is his power of deduction. This is a skill he has acquired simply by reading and regular practice. The police haven't yet discovered his talents, so Feluda has remained an amateur private detective. One look at a person is enough for him to guess, accurately, a number of things about him. When we met Dhiru Kaka at the Lucknow railway station, Feluda whispered into my ear, "Is your Kaka fond of gardening?" I knew that Dhiru Kaka had a garden, but Feluda could not have known about it. After all, Dhiru Kaka was not a relative. Baba and he were childhood friends. "How did you guess?" I asked, amazed. "When he turns round," said Feluda, still whispering, "you will see a rose leaf sticking out from under the heel of his right shoe. And the index finger of his right hand has got tincture of iodine on it. Possibly the result of messing about in a rose bush early this morning." I realized on the way to Dhiru Kaka's house from the station that Lucknow was really a beautiful place. There were buildings with turrets and minarets all around. The roads were broad and clean, and the traffic, besides motor cars, included 2 different kinds of horse-drawn carriages. One, I learned, was called a tonga, and the other was an ekka. If Dhiru Kaka hadn't met us in his old Chevrolet, we might have had to get into one of those. Dhiru Kaka said, "Aren't you now glad you came to this nice place? It's not filthy like Calcutta, Is it? Baba and Dhiru Kaka were sitting at the back. Feluda and I were both sitting beside the driver, Deendayal Singh. Feluda whispered again. Ask him about the Bulbulaya. I find it difficult not to do something if Feluda asks me to do it. So I said, What is the Bulbulaya, Dhiru Kaka? You'll see it for yourself, Dhiru Kaka laughed. It's actually a maze inside the Imambara. The Nawabs used to play hide-and-seek in it with their queens. This time Feluda himself spoke. Is it true that you cannot come out of it unless you take a trained guide with you? Yes, so I believe. Once a British soldier, it was many years ago, had a few glasses and laid a wager with someone, said no one should follow him into the maze. He'd come out himself. 2 days later, his body was found in a lane of the maze. My heart started beating faster. Did you go in alone or with a guide? I asked Feluda. I took a guide, but it's possible to go alone. Really? I stared. Well, nothing was too difficult for Feluda. I knew. How is it possible? Feluda's eyes drooped. He nodded twice, but remained silent. I could tell he would not speak. His eyes were now taking in every detail of the city of Lucknow. Dhiru Kaka was a lawyer. He had come to Lucknow 20 years ago and stayed on. He was, I believe, fairly well known in legal circles. He had lost his wife 3 years ago, and his son was in Frankfurt. He lived alone with his bearer, Jagmohan, a cook and a mali. His house in Sikandarbag was a little more than 3 miles from the station. The main gate bore his name, D.K. Sanyal, M.A., B.L.B., Advocate. A cobbled driveway led us to a bungalow. His garden lay on both sides of the driveway. I spotted a mali working with a lawnmower as we stopped at the front door. Baba said after lunch, You must be tired after your journey. I suggest we start our sightseeing from tomorrow. So I spent the whole afternoon learning card tricks from Feluda. Indians have fingers that are far more flexible than those of Europeans, Feluda told me. So it's easier for us to learn tricks that require sleight of hand. In the evening, we went out to the garden to have our tea. As we sat under a eucalyptus tree, cups and saucers in our hands, a car drew up outside the main gate. Feluda said, Fiat, without even looking. This was followed by footsteps on the driveway, and a gentleman in a grey suit appeared shortly. He was fair, wore glasses, and most of his hair was grey. Yet, it was clear that he was not very much older than Baba. Dhiru Kaka rose with a smile, his hands folded in a namaskar. Jagmohan, bring another chair, he said. Turning towards Baba, he added, Allow me to introduce a special friend. This is Dr. Srivastava. Feluda and I had both risen by this time. Feluda muttered under his breath, The chap's nervous for some reason. He forgot to greet your father. Dhiru Kaka continued, Srivastav is an osteopath and a genuine Lucknowwala. I heard Feluda whisper again, Do you know what an osteopath is? No. A doctor who specializes in problems of your bones. An extra chair arrived and we all sat down. Dr. Srivastav picked up Baba's teacup absent-mindedly and was about to take a sip when Baba coughed politely. Dr. Srivastav started, said, I'm so sorry, and put it down. Dhiru Kaka said thoughtfully, You seem a little preoccupied today. Are you thinking of a difficult case? Baba intervened at this point. You are talking to him in Bengali, Dhiru. Does he understand it? Dhiru Kaka laughed. Understand it? Good God! Why don't you quote a few lines from Tagore, Srivastav? Dr. Srivastav appeared a little uncomfortable. I know a little Bengali, he confessed, and I have read some of Tagore's works. Really? Yes, great poet. Perhaps they would now start a great discussion on poetry, I thought. But Dr. Srivastav picked up his own cup this time with an unsteady hand and said, Last night a Daku came to my house. Daku? What was that? The next words Dhiru Kaka spoke explained it. You mean a dacoit? Heavens! I thought they existed only in Madhya Pradesh. How did one get into Lucknow? Call it a dacoit or an ordinary thief. You know about my ring, don't you, Mr. Sanyal? The one Pyarelal had given you. Has it been stolen? No, but I do believe the thief came to steal it. Baba said, What's this about a ring? Dr. Srivastav turned to Dhiru Kaka. You tell him. Dhiru Kaka explained. Pyarelal Seth was a famous wealthy businessman of Lucknow. A Gujarati by birth, he had lived in Calcutta for some time, so he had a smattering of Bengali. When his son, Mahabir, was about 13, he went down with some serious ailment affecting his bones. Dr. Srivastav cured him. Pyarelal's wife was no more, and the first of his 2 sons had died of typhoid a few years earlier. So you can imagine how grateful he must have felt to Dr. Srivastav for saving the life of his only remaining child. Before he died himself, he gave a very expensive and valuable ring to Dr. Srivastav. When did he die? Last July, said Srivastav. 3 months ago. He had his first heart attack in May, which nearly killed him. That was when he gave me the ring. Then the second attack came in July. I went to visit him. It was all over in no time. Look. Srivastava brought out a blue velvet box from his pocket. It was slightly bigger than a matchbox. The evening sun fell on its content as he lifted the lid, and a bright, glittering rainbow dazzled our eyes. Dr. Srivastava looked around briefly before putting the ring out of the box. A huge white stone gleamed in the middle. It was surrounded by several smaller red, blue, and green ones. I had never seen a ring so exquisitely beautiful. I gave Feluda a sidelong glance. He was scratching his ear with a dry leaf of eucalyptus, but his eyes were fixed on the ring. It must be very old, said Baba. Is there a history behind it? Dr. Srivastav replaced the ring in the box, put it back in his pocket, and picked up his cup once more. Yes, he said, there is indeed. This ring is more than 300 years old. It once belonged to the Emperor Aurangzeb. Baba's eyes widened. You don't say? You mean the Aurangzeb, Shah Jahan's son? Yes, but the story I've heard goes back to when Aurangzeb was still only a prince. Shah Jahan was the emperor, trying to conquer Samarkand. His forces kept getting defeated. Once he sent his men under Aurangzeb's command. Aurangzeb was badly injured in the attack. He might have died, but an army officer saved him. Aurangzeb took this ring from his finger and gave it to his officer as his reward. Goodness, it's incredible. Yes, Pyarelal bought this ring in Agra from a descendant of that army officer. I don't know how much he paid for it, but I have had the stones examined. That big one is a diamond, so you can imagine its value. At least 200,000, said Dirukaka. If it was Jahannan Khan's instead of Aurangzeb's, even then it would fetch about 150,000 rupees. Dr. Srivastava said, "Now you know why I'm so upset after yesterday's incident. I live alone, you see, and I have to go out at all hours to see my patients. I could, of course, tell the police. But what if I did, and then someone attacked me? You can never tell. Can you? I had, in fact, once thought of keeping the ring in a bank, but then I felt it would not be the same. I mean, I like showing it to my friends, so I kept it in my house." Dirukaka said, "Have you shown it to many people?" "No, I got it only a few months ago, and those who come to my house are all my friends, people I trust. I haven't shown it to anyone else." It was beginning to get dark. The top of the eucalyptus tree shone in the remaining sunlight, but that would fade away soon. I looked at Dr. Srivastava. He seemed oddly restless. "Let's go in," said Dirukaka. "We need to think this over." We left the garden and went into the living room. Feluda didn't appear to be interested at all. He pulled out a pack of cards as soon as we had all sat down, and began to practice a new trick he had learned. Baba was not a great talker, but when he did speak, he chose his words carefully. "Why," he now asked, "are you assuming that the thief came simply to steal your ring? Wasn't anything else stolen? After all, he, or they, might have been just petty thieves, interested in plain cash." Srivastava said, "Well, let me explain. Thieves and burglars don't often strike in our area, chiefly because of Bonabihari Babu. Besides, Mr. Jhunjhunwala is my next-door neighbour, and Mr. Billy Moria lives next to him. Both are very rich. You can tell that just by looking at their houses. So why should a thief come to my humble abode?" "If your neighbours are rich," said Dirukaka, "they must have made arrangements to guard their wealth. A petty thief wouldn't risk breaking through heavy security. After all, big money isn't his game, is it? I suspect if he could lay his hands on 500 rupees, it would keep him going for 6 months. So I'm not surprised that they broke into your house and not your neighbour's." Dr. Srivastava continued to look doubtful. "I really don't know, Mr. Sanyal," he said. "I feel convinced they were after that ring. They opened a cupboard in the room next to mine. All its drawers were pulled out. There were other valuable things and enough time to grab them. Yet, when I woke suddenly, they ran away without taking a single thing. I find that odd. Besides—" Srivastava stopped abruptly, frowning. After a few moments of silence, he said, "When Pyarelal gave me that ring, I got the impression that he was just trying to get rid of it. For some reason, he didn't want to keep it in his house any longer. And—" He stopped again and frowned once more. "And what, Dr. Srivastava?" asked Dirukaka. Srivastava sighed. "I went to see him after his second attack. He tried to tell me something, but couldn't. But I heard one thing clearly." "What was that?" "He said it twice. A spy, a spy." Dirukaka rose from the sofa. "No, doctor," he said. "It doesn't matter what Pyarelal said. I am convinced it was just an ordinary thief. Perhaps you haven't heard, but the barrister Bhudev Mitra's house was recently burgled too. They got away with a radio and some silver. But if you're feeling nervous about keeping the ring in your house, please feel free to leave it with me. I shall put it in my Godrej Almirah, and it will be quite safe. You can collect it when you get over your nervousness." Srivastava looked visibly relieved. His lips spread in a smile. That is exactly why I came here to propose, but couldn't bring myself to say it. Thank you very much, Mr. Sanyal. I shall feel a lot easier in my mind if you keep the ring. He took the ring out of his jacket pocket and handed it to Dhirukaka, who went straight into his bedroom with it. At this point, Feluda opened his mouth. Who is Bonobihari Babu? He asked. Pardon? Dr. Srivastava was still slightly preoccupied. Didn't you just say that houses where you live were safe from burglars because of one Bonobihari Babu? Who is he? Someone in the police? Srivastava laughed. Oh, no. He has nothing to do with the police. But he gives us a special protection that's even better than what the police could give. He's quite an interesting character. His ancestors were zamindars in Bengal. When they lost their land, Bonobihari Babu went into business. He began exporting animals. Animals? Baba and Feluda spoke together. Yes, animals from here are often needed in Europe, America or Australia for their zoos, circuses and television. Many Indians are in this business. Bonobihari Babu made a lot of money, I believe. He retired about 3 years ago and came to Lucknow, together with some of his animals. He bought a house not far from mine and turned it into a zoo. How very strange, Baba exclaimed. Yes, what is special about this zoo is that all its animals are very, how shall I put it? Vicious? Yes, that's it. Most vicious. I had heard that Lucknow already had a very good zoo. Animals were kept out in the open there, on a man-made island. But what was this about a private zoo? Srivastava continued. He has a wild cat, and a hyena, an alligator, and a scorpion. You can hear some of these animals even from a distance. Thieves don't dare come our way. Feluda now asked the question that was trembling on my lips. Is it possible to see the zoo? Dhirukaka returned at this moment and said, That's simple. We can go any time. Bonobihari Babu is a most amiable man, not vicious at all. Srivastava rose to take his leave. I must go now. There is a patient I need to see. We went with him up to the main gate to see him off. He said goodbye to everyone, thanked Dhirukaka again, and drove off in his Fiat. Baba and Dhirukaka began walking back to the house. Feluda took a cigarette out of his pocket. And was about to light it when a black car shot past us and disappeared in the same direction as Dr. Srivastava's car. Standard Herald, said Feluda. I missed the number. What will you do with the number? It looked as though that car was following Dr. Srivastava. Can't you see how dark it is on the other side of the road? That's where it was waiting. The driver changed gears in front of our gate. Didn't you notice? Feluda turned towards the house. It was at least 50 yards from the gate. I could tell, for I have often run in 100-yard races in school. The light in the living room was on. I could clearly see through the window. There were Baba and Dhirukaka going into the room. Then I looked at Feluda. He was staring at the open window. The frown on his face and the way he bit his lip told me that he was worried about something. You know, Topshe. I'm not really called Topshe. My name is Topish, but Feluda has changed it to Topshe. What? I asked. I shouldn't have allowed this to happen. What are you talking about? That window should have been closed. You can see everything that goes on in that room from the gate. An ordinary bulb might have made a difference, but Dhirukaka has got a fluorescent light, which makes it worse. So what if you can see everything? Can you see your father? Just his head. He's sitting in a chair. Who was sitting in that chair 10 minutes ago? Dr. Srivastava. He stood up to show the ring to your father, remember? Yes, I don't forget things so quickly. If someone was watching from the gate, he could quite easily have seen him do it. Oh no! But why do you think there might have been someone? Feluda stooped and picked up a tiny object from the cobbled path. Silently, he handed it to me. It was a cigarette butt. Look at the tip carefully, said Feluda. I peered at it closely, and in the faint light from the street lamp, saw what I needed to see. Well? Said Feluda. Charminar, I replied, and whoever was smoking it was also chewing a pan. One end is smeared with its juice. Very good. Come, let's go in. That night, before going to bed, Feluda asked Dhirukaka to show him the ring again. The two of us had a good look at it. I had no idea Feluda knew so much about stones. He turned the ring round and round under a table lamp and kept up a running commentary. These blue stones that you see are called sapphires. The red ones are rubies and the green ones emeralds. The others, I think, are topaz. But the real thing to look at, of course, is this diamond in the middle. Not many would have had the privilege of actually holding such a stone in their hand. Then he slipped the ring onto the third finger of his left hand and said, Look, my finger is the same size as Aurangzeb's. True, the ring fitted perfectly. Feluda stared at the glittering stones and said, Who knows? This ring could have had an intriguing past. But you know what, Topshe? I am not interested in its history. Whether it had once belonged to Aurangzeb or Altamash or Akram Khan is not important. We need to know what its future is, and whether, at present, it's being chased by an admirer. If so, who is he, and why is he so desperate to get hold of it? Then he removed the ring from his finger, gave it to me, and said, Go now, give it back to Dhirukaka, and please open those windows when you return. Part 2. The next day, we left for the Imambara after an early lunch. Baba and Dhirukaka went in the car. Feluda and I both chose to ride a tonga. It was great fun. I have never ridden in a horse-drawn carriage before. Feluda had, of course. It was his view that a bumpy ride in a tonga was very good for one's digestion. Dhirukaka has such an excellent cook that I can see it's going to be difficult not to indulge myself, he said. So I think an occasional ride in a tonga is a good idea. Bumping through new and unfamiliar streets, we finally reached a place that the Tongawala said was called Kaiserbagh. See how they have mixed Urdu and German? Feluda remarked. Most of the well-known Mughal buildings were around Kaiserbagh. The Tongawala began pointing them out. There is Badshah Manzil, and that's Chandiwali Baradari, and that's called Lakhu Fatak. The path led through a huge gate. This is Rumi Darwaza, we were told. Beyond the Rumi Darwaza was Machli Bhavan, which is where the Bara Imambara stood. I gaped, speechless, at its sheer size. I had no idea a palace could be so massive. We had spotted Dhirukaka's car from our tonga. We paid the Tongawala and went to join the others. Baba and Dirukaka were talking to a tall, middle-aged man. Feluda laid a hand on my shoulder and spoke under his breath. Black Standard Herald. True enough, there was a Black Standard Herald parked next to Dirukaka's car. Look at that fresh mark on the mudguard. How do you know it's fresh? It's white paint, can't you see? That car must have brushed against a newly painted wall or a gate. If the car wasn't washed this morning, that mark could well have got there last night. Dirukaka greeted us. Come and meet Bonabihari Babu, the man with a zoo in his house. Surprised, I raised my hands in a namaskar. Was this indeed that strange man? He was fair, about 6 feet tall, sported a thin moustache and a pointed beard, and wore gold-framed glasses. The whole effect was quite impressive. He thumped me on the back and said, How do you find the capital of Lakshman? You do know, don't you, that in the ancient times Lucknow was known as Lakshmanavati? His voice matched his personality. Bonabihari Babu was going to Chowk Bazaar, said Dirukaka. He stopped here only because he saw our car. Yes, said the gentleman. I usually go out in the afternoon. Most of my mornings and evenings have to be devoted to the animals. In fact, said Dirukaka, we were planning to descend on you. These two are very interested in seeing your zoo. Good. You're welcome any time. Why don't you come today? I'm always happy to receive visitors, but most people are too scared to step into my house. They think the cages I've put my animals in are not as strong as those in a regular zoo. If that was the case, how do you suppose I have survived all these years? Everyone laughed at this little joke, with the only exception of Feluda. He leant closer to me and muttered, The man is reeking with attar. Attempt at hiding the smell of animals, probably. The Standard, as it turned out, did not belong to Bonabihari Babu, for I saw him call his driver from a blue ambassador and give him a couple of letters to post. Then he said to us, You'll see the Mambara, won't you? We can go back to my place afterwards. Are you coming in with us? Yes, why not? I have been in it just once before. That was in 1963, 2 days after I arrived in Lucknow. Time I saw again what those Nawabs could get up to. We passed through the gate and began walking across a large courtyard towards the main building. 200 years ago, said Bonabihari Babu, walking by my side, Nawab Asaf-ud-Dawla built this palace. He wanted it to outshine all the buildings in Agra and Delhi, so a competition was held among the most well-known designers and architects. The best design was selected, and you can see the final result. It may not be as beautiful as some of the other Mughal buildings, but it is certainly the number one as far as the size of a palace goes. No other place in the world has such a large audience hall. A whole football stadium could fit into this, I thought, staring at the hall. But that wasn't all. Outside, there was a massive well. The Nawab had clearly thought big. The guide told us the well was used for punishing criminals. They were simply thrown into it, and no one ever saw them again. But what took away my breath was Bulbulaya. Little passages ran in all possible directions. No matter where I went or what corners I turned, it always seemed as though I was back where I had begun. All passages were identical. Walls on both sides, a low ceiling, and, in the middle of the wall, a tiny niche. The guide said that when the Nawabs played hide-and-seek with their queens, oil lamps used to burn in those little niches. The thought of flickering lamps in those spooky little passages gave me goose pimples. Feluda, I noticed, kept very close to the wall, but I couldn't understand why he was lagging behind all of us. Then I got totally absorbed in the excitement of going through the winding maze and had forgotten all about him, until I heard Baba exclaim, "Oh, where is Felu?" I turned round quickly. Feluda was nowhere to be seen. My heart missed a beat. However, only a few seconds later, he reappeared after Baba called out to him. "If I were to walk so fast," he said, "I couldn't possibly get an idea of how the maze is designed." The door at the end of the last passage in the maze opened onto the huge roof of the Imambara. It had a wonderful view. One could see practically the whole of Lucknow from it. There were a few other people already on the roof. One of them, a young man, came walking towards Dhirukaka, smiling. "Mahabir!" Dhirukaka exclaimed. "When did you arrive?" 3 days ago. I always return to Lucknow at this time of the year. I'll go back after Diwali. I have 2 friends with me, so we are out sightseeing." "This is Pyarilal's son," said Dhirukaka. "He lives in Bombay. He's an actor." I looked at Mahabir. He was staring at Bonabihari Babu as though he had seen him before. "Have we met before?" asked Bonabihari Babu, echoing my thoughts. "Yes, I think so," Mahabir replied. "But for the life of me, I can't remember where." "I met your father once, but you were not here then." "Oh, I see," said Mahabir, embarrassed. "I must have made a mistake. Sorry. Well, I must get back to my friends. Namaskar." He left. He must be younger than Feluda, I thought. A good-looking man, and very well built. Perhaps he was interested in sports. Bonabihari Babu said, "It might be a good idea to go to my place now. If you must see the animals, it's best to do so in daylight. I haven't yet been able to arrange lights in their cages." We paid the guide and went down. A staircase ran from the roof straight to the ground floor. Just as we came out of the gate, I saw Mahabir and his friends get into the Black Standard. Chapter 3. It was nearly 4 p.m. by the time we reached Bonabihari Babu's house. It was impossible to tell from outside that the house contained a mini zoo. The animals were all kept in the back garden. This house was built about 30 years before the mutiny by a wealthy Muslim merchant, Bonabihari Babu told us. I bought it from an Englishman. The house was obviously quite old. The carvings on the wall were typically Mughal. "I hope you don't mind having coffee. There is no tea in my house, I'm afraid," said Bonabihari Babu. I felt quite pleased at this, for I wasn't allowed to have too much coffee at home. But we had to see the animals first. The living room led to a veranda, behind which sprawled a huge garden. Individual cages for the animals were strewn all over this garden. There was a pond in the middle, surrounded by tall iron spikes. An alligator lay in it, sunning itself lazily. Bonabihari Babu said, 10 years ago, when I found it in Munger, it was only a baby. I kept it in a water tank in my house in Calcutta. Then one day I discovered it had slipped out and swallowed a kitten. Little pavements ran from the pond to the other cages. A strange hissing noise came from one of them. We left the alligator and made our way to it. A large cat, nearly as big as a medium-sized dog, stared at us through bright green eyes. It had a striped body and was really more like a tiger than a cat. "This comes from Africa. An Anglo-Indian dealer in animals in Calcutta sold it to me. Even the Alipur Zoo doesn't have a creature like this. We moved on from the wildcat to look at a hyena, then a wolf, and then an American rattlesnake. I knew it was extremely poisonous. An object like a long, narrow seashell was attached to its tail, not different from the kind of shell I had often collected on the beaches of Puri. The snake shook its tail slightly as it moved, dragging the shell on the ground, making a noise like a rattle. In the western states of America, it was this noise that warned people of the movements of a rattlesnake. We saw two other creatures that made my flesh creep. In a glass case was the large and awful blue scorpion of America. In another was a spider, sticking out its black hairy legs. It was probably as big as my palm, with all my fingers spread out. This, I learned, was the famous black widow spider from Africa. The poisons of the scorpion and the spider are neurotoxins, Bonabihari Babu said. What it means is that one sting from either can kill a human being. We returned to the living room and sat down on sofas. Bonabihari Babu himself took a chair and said, "Often, in the silence of the night, I can hear the hyena laugh, the cat hiss, the wolf cry, and the snake rattle. It makes a rather strange chorus, but it helps me sleep in peace. Where would I find a better battery of bodyguards? Tell me. But then, if an outsider did break in, none of these captive animals could really do anything. I have a different arrangement to take care of that." "Bacha?" A massive black hound bounded out of the next room. This was Bonabihari Babu's real bodyguard. Not only did Bacha protect his master, but he also made sure that no harm came to the animals in the zoo. Feluda was sitting right next to me. "Labrador hound," he said softly. "The same breed as the hound of the Baskervilles." Baba had been silent throughout. Now he said, "Tell me, do you really enjoy living with these wild animals in your house?" Bonabihari Babu took a pipe and began filling it. "Why not?" he replied. "What's there to be afraid of? There was a time when I used to go hunting regularly, and my aim was perfect, but I never killed anything except wild animals. Once, only once, did I kill a deer. I was simply showing off to an American friend, trying to prove how good my aim was, and the deer was about 150 yards away. I felt such bitter remorse afterwards that I had to give up hunting altogether. But animals had become a part of my life, so I went into the business of exporting some of them. Then, when I retired, having a zoo in my house seemed only natural. The good thing about living with these animals is that they don't pretend to be anything other than what they are, vicious and venomous. But look at man. One who appears to be totally good and honest may turn out to be a first-rate criminal. You can't really trust even a close friend these days. Can you? So I have decided to spend the rest of my life in the company of animals. I don't meddle in other people's affairs, you see. I keep to myself. So what others think or say about my lifestyle doesn't matter to me at all. But I've been told that my little zoo has been responsible for keeping burglars at bay. If that is true, I must say I've unwittingly done some good to the whole community." This last remark made me first look at Dirukaka and then at Feluda. Could it be that Bonabihari Babu didn't know about the attempted theft at Dr. Srivastava's house? I didn't have to wait long to get an answer. Dr. Srivastava himself arrived almost as soon as Bonabihari Babu's bearer appeared with the coffee and some sweets. After greeting everyone, Dr. Srivastava said to Dhirukaka, "A boy fell from a tree and broke his arm, not very far from where you live. I went to your house after seeing him. Your bearer told me you hadn't returned, so I came straight here." Dhirukaka gave Dr. Srivastava a reassuring look, to indicate that his ring was safe. Srivastava appeared to know Bonabihari Babu quite well. Perhaps friendliness among neighbors ran more easily in small towns. "Bonabihari Babu," he said jokingly, "your watchmen are getting slack." Bonabihari Babu was taken aback. "What do you mean?" he asked. "A thief broke into my house the day before yesterday, and none of your animals made a noise." "What? A thief? In your house? When?" "At about 3 a.m. No, he didn't actually take anything. I woke suddenly, so he ran away." "Even so, I must say he must have been an expert to have escaped Badshah's attention. Why, your house can't be more than a couple of 100 yards from mine. Whoever it was must have walked past my compound. There is no other way." "Never mind," said Srivastava. "I just wanted you to know what had happened." The sweets were still lying on our plates. "Have some of these," Bonabihari Babu invited. "These are called Sandile ka Laddu and Gulabi Reuri. These are Buna Pera. All three are a specialty of Lucknow." I wasn't too fond of sweets, so I paid little attention to these words and began watching Bonabihari Babu closely. He seemed a little thoughtful. Feluda, however, was busy stuffing himself. Having eaten 2 laddus already, he stretched out a hand and pretended to wave a fly away from my coffee cup. Before I knew it, he had picked up a laddu from my plate with supreme nonchalance. Rather unexpectedly, at this point, Bonabihari Babu returned to Srivastava and asked, "Hope you still have the Emperor's ring?" Dr. Srivastava choked. Then, pulling himself together with an effort, he covered the sudden fit of coughing with a small laugh and said, "Good God, you haven't forgotten." Bonabihari Babu blew out smoke from his pipe. "How could I forget? Mind you, I'm not really interested in such things. But you don't often get to see something so remarkable, do you?" "Oh, the ring's quite safe," said Dr. Srivastava. "I'm aware of its value." Bonabihari Babu stood up. "Excuse me," he said. "It's time to feed my cat." We took our cue and rose with him to take our leave. On our way out, we saw a man carry a bag into the house. A powerful man, no doubt. His muscles were bulging under his shirt. His name was Ganesh Guha, we learned. He had apparently been with Bonabihari Babu for a long time, right from the days of animal exporting. He now looked after the zoo. "I couldn't have managed without Ganesh," Bonabihari Babu told us. "That man knows no fear. Once the white cat clawed him. He stayed on, despite that." "It was really a pleasure to have you," he continued, as we got into our car. "Do come again. You're going to be in Lucknow for some time, aren't you?" "Yes," said Baba, "but we might go to Haridwar for a few days." "I see. Someone told me of a 12-foot python that's just been found near Lakshmanjula. As a matter of fact, I was toying with the idea of going there myself." We dropped Dr. Srivastava at his house. Just as he got out of the car, a sudden strange, eerie howl coming from Bonabihari Babu's garden startled us all. Only Feluda yawned and said, "Hyena." Heavens! So this was the famous laugh of a hyena. It chilled my blood. Yes, that noise often gave me the creeps, Dr. Srivastava said through the window. But now I've got used to it. You didn't have any further problems last night, did you? Dhiru Kaka asked. No, nothing, Dr. Srivastava laughed. It was nearly dark by the time we got home. From somewhere in the distance came the sound of drum beats. Preparations for Ram Leela, Dhiru Kaka explained. What is Ram Leela? Oh, it's a North Indian performance held during the Shera. The whole story of the Ramayana is staged as a play. It ends with Ram and Lakshman galloping across in a chariot and shooting arrows at a colossal effigy of Ravan. The effigy is filled with gunpowder, so when the arrows hit it, it bursts into flames. Crackers burst and rockets fly, and eventually the mighty Ravan is reduced to ashes. Oh, it's a spectacle worth watching. Dr. Srivastava came while you were out, Dhiru Kaka's bearer told us as we got home, and a Sadhu Baba. He waited for about half an hour and then left. Sadhu Baba? It was obvious that Dhiru Kaka had not been expecting a visit from a holy man. Where did he wait? In the living room. And he wanted to see me? Yes. Did he actually mention any name? Yes. That's strange. Dhiru Kaka thought for a minute, then suddenly rushed into his bedroom. We heard him open his Godrej almirah, which was followed by an agonized cry. Oh no! Disaster! Baba, Feluda and I ran after him. Dhiru Kaka was standing with the small blue velvet box open in his hand, his eyes bulging. The box was empty. He stared foolishly into space for a few seconds. Then he flopped down on his bed with a thud. Chapter 4. It seemed cooler the following morning, so Baba told me to wrap a muffler round my throat. I could tell from his frown and preoccupied air that he was deeply worried. Dhiru Kaka had left the house very early in the morning, without telling anyone where he was going. After yesterday's incident, he had said only one thing over and over. How will I face Srivastava now? Baba had tried to comfort him by saying, But it wasn't your fault. How were you to know the thief would turn up in your absence dressed as a sadhu? Why don't you go to the police? Didn't you say you knew Inspector Gargari? So it could be that Dhiru Kaka had gone to inform the police. Baba said over breakfast, I had thought of taking you to the residency, but perhaps it's best that I stay in today. You two can go out for a while, if you like. I nearly smiled at this, for Feluda had already said he'd like to explore the place on foot, and I had decided to join him. I knew what he had in mind was something other than just aimless walking. His eyes had taken on a steely glint since last night. We left shortly after 8. As soon as we were out of the house, Feluda said, Let me warn you, Topshe. If you talk or ask too many questions, I'll send you back. Just keep your mouth shut and walk side by side. But what if Dhiru Kaka informs the police? So what if he does? Suppose they catch the thief before you? No matter. I'll change my name, that's all. Dhiru Kaka lived on Fraser Road. It was a quiet street, with houses which had large gardens on either side. It led to Dupling Road. Unlike Calcutta, all roads in Lucknow were clearly marked. There was a pawn shop at the corner where Dupling Road joined Park Road. Feluda ambled towards this shop. Can I have a sweet pawn? He asked. Yes, Babu. "I'll make you one with special masala," said the panwala. "Thank you." The pan was duly handed to him. Feluda paid for it, put it in his mouth, and said, "Look, I'm new to this town. Can you tell me where I can find the Ramakrishna mission?" "Ramakrishna Mission?" No, Ramakrishna mission. I've heard that a great sadhu is visiting Lucknow and is staying at the Ramakrishna mission." The panwala shook his head and muttered something I couldn't catch, but we got some information from another source. A man with a huge moustache was lying on a string bed nearby, singing merrily and beating an old rusted tin. He now stopped singing and said, "Would that be a bearded Sadhu Baba, wearing dark glasses? Yesterday I spoke to such a man. He asked me where the nearest Tonga stand was, and I showed him." "Where is it?" 5 minutes from here. Just after that crossing, you can see a whole row of Tongas." "Shukriya," said Feluda. That was thank you in Urdu, he said to me as an aside. I had never heard the word before. The 8 Tongawala we asked admitted that a bearded, saffron-clad man had indeed hired his Tonga the previous evening. "Where did you take him?" "Ishtichan," said the Tongawala. "You mean the railway station?" Yes. "How much do you charge to get there?" 75 paise. "And how long does it take?" 10 minutes. "If I pay you whole rupee, can you get us to the station in 8 minutes? Now?" "Why? Have you a train to catch?" "Yes, the best train in the world, the Imperial Express." The Tongawala grinned foolishly and said, "All right, I'll get you there in 8 minutes." On our way, I asked a little hesitantly, "Do you think the sadhu is still waiting at the station, clutching the ring?" At this, Feluda glared at me so furiously that I promptly shut up. A little later, he asked our driver, "Did the Sadhu Baba have any luggage?" The driver thought for a minute and said, "Yes, I think he had a case, but not a large one." "I see." On reaching the station, we began asking all the likely people who might remember having seen the sadhu. But those at the ticket booth or the gate couldn't help, nor could the porters. The manager of a restaurant at the railway station said, "Are you talking about Pavitrananda Thakur, the one who lives in Dehradun? He arrived only 3 days ago. He couldn't have gone back so early. Besides, he always travels with a huge entourage." At last, the chowkidar of the first-class waiting room said he had seen a man who fitted our description. "Did he sit here in the waiting room?" "No, he didn't." "Well?" "He went into the bathroom. He was carrying a small case." "What happened then?" "I don't know, Babu. I didn't see him after that." "Were you here throughout?" "Yes. The Doon Express was about to arrive. There were a lot of people there. I didn't leave the room at all." "Perhaps you didn't notice him again." "Well, all right, perhaps I didn't." But the man looked as though what he really wanted to say was that if the Sadhu Baba had come out of the bathroom, he would certainly have seen him. If that was the case, where had the sadhu disappeared? We came out of the station. Here, too, stood a row of Tongas. We got into one. I was beginning to look upon these contraptions with a new respect. The last one had taken exactly 7 minutes and 57 seconds to reach the station. I couldn't help asking another question as we set off. Did the Sadhu Baba simply vanish in the bathroom? Yes, he might have done, said Feluda. Sadhus and sannyasis in the olden days could disappear at will, or so I've heard. I knew he wasn't serious, but he spoke with such a perfectly straight face that it was impossible to tell. A funny noise greeted us as we reached the main road. It sounded like a band, and it was coming closer. Bang, bang, twiddle-dee-dum. Then we saw it was a tonga like ours, with the difference that this one was decorated with artificial flowers, balloons, and colorful flags. The music was coming from a loudspeaker, and a man wearing a fool's cap was throwing great fistfuls of printed paper at people. Advertisement for a Hindi film, Feluda said. He was right. I could see, as the other tonga went past us, that a brightly painted poster was pasted on its side. The film was called Daku Mansoor. A couple of handbills landed in our tonga, and with them came a white sheet of paper, screwed into a ball. It hit against Feluda's chest and fell on the floor. I saw the man who threw it, Feluda, I yelled. He was dressed like an Afghan, but... Before I could finish speaking, Feluda had picked up the piece of paper, clambered down, and started to run in the man's direction. I simply watched with amazement the speed at which he ran, despite jostling crowds, without colliding into anyone. The driver, by this time, had stopped the tonga. I could do nothing but wait. The music from the loudspeaker had grown faint, although a few urchins were still busy collecting the handbills. Feluda returned a few moments later, panting. He jumped into the tonga, gestured to the driver to start, and said, "He managed to escape only because I wasn't familiar with the little alleyways of this place." "Did you actually see him?" I asked. "How could I have missed him when even you saw him?" I said nothing more. If Feluda hadn't already seen the man, I would have said that although he was dressed like one, the man was remarkably short for an Afghan. Feluda now took out the screwed-up piece of paper, smoothed it out, and read its contents. Then he folded it 3 times and put it in his wallet. I did not dare ask what was written on it. We returned home to discover that Dhirukaka had come back, and with him was Srivastava. The latter did not appear to be too upset by the loss of his ring. "That ring had a jinx on it, I tell you," he said. "It caused trouble everywhere it went. You were lucky it was stolen in your absence. Suppose they had broken into your house at night? Suppose they had turned violent?" Dhirukaka smiled at this. "That would have made more sense," he said. "This man simply made a fool of me. It is this that I find so hard to accept." "Stop worrying, Dhirubabu. That ring would have gone anyway, even if I didn't part with it. And please don't go to the police. That would make matters worse. Whoever it was might try to attack you again." All this while, Feluda was leafing through a copy of Life magazine. He now laid it aside, leant back in the sofa, and asked, "Does Mahabir know about this ring?" "You mean Pyarelal's son?" "Yes." "Well, I don't know for sure. He used to be in Doon school. Then he joined the military academy, but left it eventually and went off to Bombay. Now he has become an actor, I believe." "Did Pyarelal approve of his son acting in films?" "He never mentioned anything to me, but I know he was very fond of his son." "Was Mahabir in Lucknow when Pyarelal died?" "No, he was in Bombay. He arrived as soon as he heard the news," Dhirukaka said. "Good heavens, Felu, you are asking questions like the police." He is an amateur detective, you see, Baba explained. He has a positive knack in these matters. Dr. Srivastava looked at Feluda with undisguised surprise. That's good, he said. Very good indeed. Only Dhiru Kaka remarked, a little dryly, I thought. And the thief took something from the very house where we have a detective staying. That is regrettable, isn't it? Feluda made no comment. Instead, he turned to Srivastava and asked another question. Is Mahabir earning enough from films? I don't know about that. He went to Bombay only 2 years ago. He does have plenty of money, doesn't he? I mean... Yes, Pyarelal left him all his property. Acting in films is more or less just a pastime for him. Said Feluda and picked up the Life again. Srivastava suddenly looked at his watch and exclaimed, My God, is that the time? I forgot all about my patient. Sorry, you'll have to excuse me. Dhiru Kaka and Baba went out with him. Feluda dropped the magazine on the table and asked, Where would you like to go? The moon or Mars? At this moment, I replied, I'd like to do just one thing. Feluda paid no attention to me. I have just seen a picture of the surface of the moon in that magazine. It didn't seem very interesting. I feel curious about Mars. I rose from my chair. Feluda, I said, what I am curious about is that piece of paper in your wallet. Oh, that! Here, look. He flicked the neatly folded paper towards me as though he was playing carom. I opened it and found just 2 words. Watch out. The writer had used a real liquid of some kind. It wasn't ink. What could it be? Feluda must have guessed what I was thinking, for he said, Sometimes, after a pan has been stuffed with masala, some of its juice overflows onto the stalk. Those words were written with the red juice from a pan. I brought the paper close to my nose. It smelt distinctly of pan. But who could have written it? I don't know. Why should anybody tell you to watch out? You didn't steal the ring. Feluda burst out laughing. The culprit doesn't get warnings and threats, silly. They are given to the culprit's enemy. And a detective is always an enemy. So whoever chases a criminal has to risk his life. My heart beat faster and my throat started to go dry. I swallowed hard and said, In that case, we should perhaps take some steps to protect ourselves. And who told you I haven't taken those steps already? Said Feluda and took out a small round tin from his pocket. Denticare, it said. Why, it was only a tin of tooth powder. I had seen my grandfather use it years ago. Surprised, I asked, what would you do with tooth powder, Feluda? Don't be silly. It's not tooth powder. What is it then? Feluda widened his eyes, stretched his neck, and proclaimed proudly, It's powdered thunder. Chapter 5. That night, after dinner, Feluda said suddenly, Topshe, what do you make of all this? All what? Everything that's happened so far. Why, you should know. You're the detective. Besides, how can I draw many conclusions until we find out who that sannyasi was? But surely certain things are quite clear. For instance, the fact that the sannyasi went into the bathroom and didn't come out. Now that is pretty revealing. isn't it? What does it reveal? Can't you figure that out? Well, all it can mean is that the Chowkidar was not paying enough attention. No, no, you ass. What then? If the sannyasi had indeed come out, the Chowkidar would definitely have seen him. You mean he never did? Do you remember what he was carrying? Look, I wasn't... Oh yes, he had a small attaché case. Have you ever seen a sannyasi with an attaché case? No, can't say I have. Well, I think that's distinctly suspicious. What do you suspect? That sannyasi was no more than a non-sannyasi, just like you and me, and his normal clothes were in that attaché case. The saffron robe was a disguise. Possibly the beard was false too. Oh, I see. You mean he changed into different clothes, stuffed his robe into the case, and came out looking totally different. No wonder the Chowkidar could not recognize him. Yes, now you're talking. But who threw that piece of paper at you? Either the fake sannyasi himself, or one of his men. He must have heard us making inquiries at the station, so he decided to give us a warning. All right, but are there any more mysteries? There is no end to them, my boy. Who followed Dr. Srivastava in that black car? Who was watching us from the gate, smoking a charminar and chewing a pan? Was it the same sannyasi, or was it someone else? What spy did Pyarelal talk about? Why does Bonobihari Babu keep wild animals in his house? Where had Mahabir seen Bonobihari Babu before? How much does he know about the ring? I lay awake that night, thinking these things over. Feluda was scribbling something in a blue notebook. Then he put it away and went to bed at 10:30. Soon he was fast asleep. Drums beat in the distance. Oh yes, Ramlila. I heard an animal at some stage. It might have been a dog or a jackal, but it sounded like a hyena. Why was Feluda puzzled by Bonobihari Babu's wild animals? One didn't always have to do things for a specific reason, did one? People had strange hobbies, so perhaps keeping wild animals was just a hobby for him. It's difficult to tell when I fell asleep, nor can I tell what woke me. It was still dark, and everything was very quiet. The drums were silent, as were the animals. All I could hear was Feluda breathing heavily in his sleep next to me, and the alarm clock ticking behind my head. Then my eyes fell on the window. Normally, I could see a fair bit of the starry sky through the open window. Tonight, something blocked most of it. As the last remnants of sleep cleared from my eyes, I realized with a shock what it was. A man was standing outside at the window, holding its bars and staring into our room. My heart stood still. Yet, I couldn't take my eyes off that figure. The room was utterly dark, and the starlight outside was not good enough to see the man's face. But I could make out that the lower half of his face was covered by a dark cloth. Now he put a hand through the bars in the window. But no, it wasn't just his hand. He was holding a rod. A sweet yet strong smell hit my nostrils. I was already breathless with fear. Now my limbs began to go numb. I tried to muster all my willpower. Then slowly, without moving my body, I stretched out my left arm towards Feluda. He was still asleep. My eyes hadn't moved from the window. The man was still holding the rod, and that smell was getting stronger. I began to feel giddy. At this moment, My hand brushed against Feluda's waist. I gave him a nudge. Feluda moved slightly, and his bed creaked noisily with the movement. In that instant, the man vanished from the window. "Why are you poking at me?" asked Feluda sleepily. I swallowed and tried to speak. "Window," I managed. "What about the window? Whose... God, what's that smell?" Fully awake, Feluda jumped up and ran to the window. He stared out of it for a few moments, then turned back to me. "Tell me exactly what you saw." I was still finding it difficult to talk. "A man," I croaked, "with a rod. Inside." "Did he stretch the rod out into our room?" "Yes." "I see. He must have had chloroform dabbed on that rod. He wanted us to faint." "But why?" "It could be a different thief. Maybe he thought the ring was still in our house." "Never mind. Go back to sleep now. And please don't tell your father or Dirukaka about this. They'll only get nervous and spoil all my work." The next morning, both Baba and Dirukaka appeared more relaxed. The police had been informed, and Inspector Gargari had already started working on the case. So it wasn't likely that there would be any further problem. I sent up a silent prayer for Feluda. "Dear God, don't let the police win. Let it be Feluda who finds the ring. May the full credit go to him, not the police." Baba said, "I'm thinking of taking you out today to a few other places." We decided to leave after lunch. But before a final decision could be taken on where we should go, Bono Bihari Babu turned up at the house. It was he who eventually settled the matter. "I had to come when I heard of the daylight robbery," he said. "If only you had a hound, Dhiru Babu, this wouldn't have happened. A well-trained pedigree hound would have taken just 5 seconds to figure out what the sadhu's intentions were. But what's the use of offering you advice now? The damage is done. Never mind. Have one of these," he added, unwrapping the small packet he was carrying. "These are the best pan in Lucknow. Benares is the only other place where you can find such good quality pan." I began to feel slightly uneasy. If Bono Bihari Babu stayed for too long, our plans for the afternoon would be spoilt. But he asked at this point, "Are you planning to go out, or will you stay in?" Baba said, "Well, these fellows haven't seen anything except the Imambara, so I was thinking of taking them somewhere else." "Haven't you seen the residency?" Bono Bihari Babu asked me. I shook my head. "Then allow me to show it to you. You won't find a guide like me. I have a thorough knowledge of the mutiny." Then he turned to Dirukaka and said, "There is only one thing I'm feeling curious about. Where did you keep the ring? In a chest?" "No, I haven't got one in my house. The thief took it from my Godrej Almirah. The key, of course, was in my pocket. He must have used a duplicate." "I believe he left the box behind?" "Yes." "Very strange. Was the box in a drawer?" "Yes." "And you searched the drawer thoroughly, I presume?" "Every inch of it." "You could check for fingerprints, couldn't you? I mean, on the handle of the Almirah and that little box." "That wouldn't help. Both are full of my own fingerprints." Bono Bihari Babu shook his head and said, "Pyarelal was a strange man. He didn't even bother to have the ring insured. And the person he gave it to was just as foolish. However, I hope he's now learnt a lesson." We didn't get the chance to take a tonga this time. All of us got into Bono Bihari Babu's car. Feluda and I sat in the front. As we were passing through Clive Road, Bonobihari Babu asked us, "Did you ever think you'd get involved in such a mysterious event in Lucknow?" I shook my head. Feluda chuckled. Baba spoke for him. "Felu is thrilled to be here," he said, "because he's very interested in such things. He's an amateur sleuth, you see." "Indeed?" Bonobihari Babu sounded both surprised and pleased. "It's an excellent way of exercising the brain. Well, Felu Babu, how far have you got?" "I've only just started. I don't know what you would call a mystery, but certainly I am mystified by many things." "What do you mean?" asked Dirukaka. "Well, how do you suppose that sannyasi got hold of a duplicate key? Besides, your house wasn't totally empty. How could he go into your bedroom knowing that the bearer and the cook were in the house? In any case, one little thing has always worried me." "What is that?" "Did Pyarilal really give that ring to Dr. Srivastava? Or did Sri—" "What are you saying, Bonobihari Babu? Surely you don't suspect poor Dr. Srivastava?" "Why not? Everyone is under suspicion until this matter gets cleared up. And that includes you and me. Isn't that right, Felu Babu?" "Certainly. We mustn't forget that Dr. Srivastava and the Sadhu Baba had both gone to our house that evening," said Feluda. "Exactly." Bonobihari Babu seemed to grow positively excited. Baba spoke a little haltingly. "But if Srivastava had indeed used unfair means to get hold of that ring, why should he give it to us for safekeeping? And then why should he steal it again?" Bonobihari Babu laughed out loud. "That's simple. His house was burgled, so he got frightened and passed the ring on to you. But temptation didn't leave him, so he stole it back, fooled the real thief, and killed two birds with one stone." I began to feel quite confused. How could an amiable gentleman like Srivastava be a thief? Was Feluda in agreement with what had just been said? Or had his suspicion fallen on Dr. Srivastava only after Bonobihari Babu began speaking? In fact, he hadn't finished. "Srivastava is a nice enough man, I agree," Bonobihari Babu went on. "But just think for a minute. He has built his own house, stuffed it with expensive furniture, and he certainly lives in style. Now, how could he have done that? I mean, how much does he earn as an osteopath in a small little town like Lucknow?" Dirukaka said, "Who knows? Perhaps his father left him some money." "No, his father was just a clerk in the post office in Allahabad." At this point, Feluda suddenly asked something completely irrelevant. "Have you ever been bitten by any of your animals?" "No, never." "What is that mark on your right wrist?" "Oh, ho, ho. You do have sharp eyes, I must say. That mark normally stays hidden under my sleeve. It's the result of fencing. My opponent's sword scratched my wrist." The residency was really worth seeing. It was a beautiful place. There were trees everywhere, and, amidst them, a few broken old British houses, all built in the mid-19th century. On the trees sat large groups of monkeys. Lucknow, I had heard, was well known for its monkeys. Now I could see for myself what these creatures could get up to. A few street urchins were firing stones at the monkeys from their catapults. Bonobihari Babu went across and gave them a nasty earful. Then he returned to us and said, "I cannot stand cruelty to animals. Unfortunately, there's plenty of it to be seen in our country." I had read about the Sepoy Mutiny. Going through the residency made those events pass through my mind like pictures on a screen. Bonabihari Babu, in the meantime, had begun his commentary. During the time of the mutiny, Lucknow was ruled by the Nawab. The British forces were all stationed in the residency here. Henry Lawrence was their commander-in-chief. When trouble started, most of the other British men and women in Lucknow went and took refuge in a hospital. Sir Henry fought bravely, but was eventually killed by the sepoys. What happened to the British after that is obvious from the state of this building. If Sir Colin Campbell hadn't arrived with reinforcements, heaven knows what greater horrors the British in Lucknow would have had to endure. This was their billiard room. Just look what those cannonballs did to it. Baba and Diru Kaka had gone for a walk since they had both seen the residency before. Only Feluda and I were inside, totally engrossed in what Bonabihari Babu was saying, and looking at the remains of the broken buildings, all built 200 years ago. Suddenly, through a hole in the wall, something came flying in. It shot past Feluda's ear, bumped against the opposite wall, and fell on the ground with a thud. It turned out to be a stone. In the next moment, I saw Bonabihari Babu pull Feluda sharply to one side, just as another stone came in and fell on the floor. There was no doubt that both had been thrown with a catapult. Bonabihari Babu, despite his age, moved with remarkable agility. He jumped through a bigger gap in the wall and landed on the grass outside. Feluda and I joined him almost immediately. We all saw a bearded man running away. He was wearing a black coat and a red fez cap. Feluda rose to his feet without a word and ran after him. I was about to follow, but Bonabihari Babu pulled me back, saying, "You are still only a schoolboy, Tapesh. It's better that you stay out of this." Feluda returned in a few minutes. "Did you catch him?" asked Bonabihari Babu. "No," said Feluda. "I was too far behind." He got into a black standard car and fled. "Scoundrel!" Bonabihari Babu muttered. "Come on now, we'd better get out of here." A little later, we met Baba and Diru Kaka. "Why are you panting, Felu?" Baba asked. "Perhaps he should give up being a sleuth," said Bonabihari Babu. "I think a gunda's after him." Both Baba and Diru Kaka began to look rather alarmed when they heard our story. But, in the end, Bonabihari Babu laughed. "Don't look so worried," he said. "I was only joking. Those stones were actually meant for me, not Felu. Didn't you see me yell at those boys? It was simply their way of paying me back." Then he turned to Feluda and said, "Even so, Felu Babu, I would say that you really must be more careful. After all, you are young and new to this place. Why get involved in something that does not concern you?" Feluda remained silent. We began walking back to the car. "Was it really him they were trying to hit? Or was it you?" I whispered to Feluda. "Do you think he'd have taken it so quietly if he was their target? Wouldn't he have screamed the roof down, or what's left of it?" "I agree with you. But I've got hold of one little thing. That man dropped it." Feluda took out a small black object from his pocket. It was a false moustache. One side still showed traces of gum. He put it back in his pocket and said, "Bonabihari Babu knows very well those stones had been thrown at me." "Then why didn't he say so?" "Well, either because he didn't want us to get worried, or..." "Or what?" Feluda didn't reply. Instead, he inclined his head, snapped his fingers, and said, "The plot gets thicker and thicker, Topshe. You're not to disturb me at all." He did not speak to me again that day. On returning home, he spent most of his time either pacing up and down in the garden or scribbling in his blue notebook. I took a quick look at what he had written when he went out into the garden, but I couldn't read a single word, for the script used was something I had never seen before. Chapter 6. Feluda got into the tonga and said to the driver, "Hazratganj." "Where is that?" I asked. "It is the Chaurangi of Lucknow. There's lots to see in this town, beside royal palaces. I want to look at the shops today." Yesterday, from the residency, we had gone to Bono Bihari Babu's house for coffee and taken a look at all the animals once more: the hyena, the rattlesnake, the spider, the wildcat, and the scorpion. While having coffee in the living room, Feluda had looked at a locked door and said to Bono Bihari Babu, "I had noticed it was locked the last time we were here. Where does it lead to?" "Oh yes, it's just a spare room. I've kept it locked ever since I moved in. Didn't want to take the trouble of having it cleaned, you see." "In that case, the padlock on it must have been recently changed, for it isn't rusted at all." Bono Bihari Babu's smile did not falter, but he gave Feluda a very sharp look. "Yes," he said, "the old one got so rusty that I was obliged to change it." Baba changed the subject. "We were thinking of going to Haridwar and Lakshmanjula," he said. Bono Bihari Babu lit his pipe and blew out a pungent-smelling smoke. "When would you like to go?" he asked. "If you leave the day after tomorrow, I can come with you. I told you about that 12-foot python, didn't I? I really must take a look at it. Besides, our sleuth has turned so active that it might be a good idea for all of us to go out of town for a while." Nirukaka said, "I cannot do that quite so easily. But there is no reason why the three of you can't go. Felu and Topish mustn't go back without having seen Lakshmanjula." "If you come with me," said Bono Bihari Babu, "I can arrange for you to stay at a dharamshala I know, and get a car to take you to Lakshmanjula from Haridwar. I know a lot of people there. Now you must decide what you want to do." We decided to go with Bono Bihari Babu on Friday, which was the day after tomorrow. Even a couple of days ago, I would have been quite pleased to have Bono Bihari Babu accompany us, but the incident at the residency had made me feel doubtful about the man. But Feluda didn't seem to mind, so I told myself not to worry. "This morning," Feluda said, "I've run out of razor blades. Let's go and get some." And so we were out in a tonga, going to Hazratganj. Apparently, you could get anything you wanted in Hazratganj. Feluda had been totally silent since yesterday regarding the matter of the ring. When he had gone for his bath this morning, I had tried to read his scribbles once more, but they still didn't make any sense. One or two letters appeared to be English, but the rest were all totally strange. Sitting beside him in the tonga, I couldn't contain my curiosity any longer, and told him what I had done. He was furious at first. "What you have done is despicable," he said sternly. "Why, one could call you a criminal." Then he relented a little. "You could never read those words," he said more amiably, "because you don't know the script." "What script is it?" "Greek." "And the language? Is that Greek too?" "No, it's English." "Where did you learn to write in Greek?" "A long time ago, when I had just joined college. Some of those letters, of course, I had learnt in my math class. You know, things like alpha, beta, gamma, delta, mu, pi, epsilon. I learnt the others from the Encyclopedia Britannica. If you write something in English using Greek letters, it sounds like a code. No one could possibly make any sense of it. How would you spell Lucknow in Greek? Lambda epsilon kappa mu omicron epsilon. The letters C and W do not exist in Greek, so the spelling would be Luknou. And how would you spell Calcutta? Kappa alpha lambda kappa epsilon tau tau alpha. Good heavens! It would take an hour to spell just 3 words. Hazratganj wasn't exactly Chowrangi, but it had some nice shops. We paid the tonga off and began walking. Look, Feluda, there is a stationery shop. They'll have blades. Wait, there is something else I need to do. Feluda suddenly stopped before a shop. Mulkani and Company, Antique and Curio Dealers. Its signboard proclaimed in large letters. One look at the showcase outside told me it was a shop that sold old things. Inside, it was packed with ancient jewelry, carpets, clocks, furniture, chandeliers, framed photographs, and heaven knows what else. A silvered-haired gentleman in gold-framed glasses came forward to greet us. Do you have any jewelry dating back to the Mughal times? No, I'm afraid not. But I could show you shields and armors of that period. Will that do? Feluda picked up an attardan, perfume container, and turned it in his hand. I have seen some old jewelry in Pyarilal's house, he remarked casually. He was a regular customer here, wasn't he? The man seemed taken aback. Who? Which Pyarilal are you talking about? Pyarilal Seth, the one who died a few months ago. Mr. Mulkani shook his head and said, No, he never bought anything from us, although ours is the biggest shop of this kind in Lucknow. I see. In that case, he must have bought those things in Calcutta. Probably. Who are your biggest buyers here? It was obvious from Mr. Mulkani's expression that he didn't have too many big buyers. Well, he said, tourists from abroad sometimes buy things from us at a good price. Among the locals is Mr. Mehta, who buys a few things occasionally, and there is Mr. Pestenji, who's one of my oldest customers. He bought a real Persian carpet only the other day for 3,000 rupees. Feluda suddenly pointed at a barge and asked, Isn't that from Bengal? Yes, Murshidabad. Just look at it, Topshe. Isn't it beautiful? It was. Made of ivory, it was perfect in every detail. A Nawab sat on its roof under a canopy, smoking from a hubble-bubble. Courtier sat by his side, and, before him, stood a group of musicians and dancers. 16 oarsmen were rowing, and 1 man sat at the rudder. Besides these, there were guards and messengers and every other personage necessary in a royal entourage. I couldn't take my eyes away. Where did you get that? Feluda asked. Mr. Sarkar sold it to me. Which Mr. Sarkar? Mr. B. Sarkar, who lives in Badshanagar. He, too, has occasionally bought a few things from me. He's got a good collection. I see. Well, all right then. You've got a nice little shop here. I'm glad to have seen it. Thank you. Good day, sir. We came out of the shop. That means Bonobihari Sarkar frequents these shops, said Feluda. I had had my suspicions all along. But he said he wasn't interested in such things. If he wasn't, how could he tell at one glance whether a stone was real or fake? A shop called the Empire Bookstall was next door to Mulkani & Co. Feluda wanted to buy a book on Haridwar and Lakshman Jula. so we went in and found Pyarilal's son, Mahabir. Feluda whispered softly, "I can see he's buying a book on cricket." "Very good." Mahabir was standing with his back to us. Feluda went up to the man behind the counter and said, "Do you have anything by Neville Cardus?" Mahabir spun round immediately. I knew Cardus had written some very good books on cricket. "Are you looking for a particular book?" asked the bookseller. "Yes, the one called Centuries." "No, I'm afraid we don't have that one. Shall I show you some other book?" Mahabir came forward with a smile. "Are you a cricket enthusiast?" he asked. "Yes, so apparently are you," Feluda replied. Mahabir looked at the book he was holding. "Yes," he said, "I had ordered this one. It's Bradman's autobiography." "Oh, I see. I've read that one. A brilliant book." Who do you think was a greater cricketer, Ranji or Bradman? Soon, both were involved in an animated discussion. After a few minutes, Mahabir said, "The Quality restaurant isn't far from here. Why don't we sit down and have a cup of tea?" Feluda agreed. The three of us trooped into the restaurant. I ordered a Coca-Cola and the others asked for tea. "Do you play yourself?" Mahabir asked. "I used to," Feluda said. "I have played here in Lucknow." "What about you?" "I was in the first 11 at the Doon School. My father, too, was a good player in school." A shadow passed over his face. Feluda began pouring the tea. "You must have heard about the ring," he said. "Yes," Mahabir replied. "I went to visit Dr. Srivastava. He told me." "Did you know your father had that ring and that he wanted to give it to his Dr. Srivastava?" "My father had told me a long time ago that he wanted to give something of value to Srivastava for making me well. I did not come to know what it was until after his death. Dr. Srivastava himself told me." Then he looked straight at Feluda. "Why are you taking such an interest?" Feluda smiled. "It's just a sort of hobby." Mahabir sipped his tea and said nothing. "Who else is there in your house?" Feluda asked quietly. "An old aunt and some servants." "Have they been with you for some time?" "All from even before I was born. Pritam Singh, our bearer, was with my father in Calcutta 35 years ago." "Did your father have any other articles like that ring?" "I don't know. In fact, I had quite forgotten about this interest my father had. He began collecting antiques when I was very small. I opened an old chest only the other day. There were some other things of that period, but none as valuable as the ring." I sipped my Coca-Cola through a straw. Mahabir paused, then lowered his voice. "Pritam Singh told me something rather strange." Feluda waited for him to continue. Mahabir looked round carefully and leant forward, still speaking softly. He said he had heard my father scream that morning before he had had his second attack. "Oh?" Pritam Singh didn't, at first, pay much attention, since my father used to suffer from backache and often cried out in pain while rising from a chair or his bed. Yet, he would never allow anyone to help him up. Pritam Singh thought it was his backache that was bothering him again that morning. But now, he says he might have been mistaken, because apparently my father had screamed very loudly. "Do you happen to know if anyone had visited your father that day? Can Pritam Singh remember anything?" "That's something I've already asked him, but he cannot say anything definitely. Father did occasionally have visitors in the morning, but Preetham can't now recall whether anyone in particular had visited him that day. When he eventually went into my father's room, he found him in pretty bad shape, but he was alone. Preetham then rang Dr. Srivastava as a doctor who normally treated father. Dr. Graham was away in Allahabad, attending a conference. And what about the spy? Spy? What spy? Mahabir sounded profoundly startled. Oh, clearly you haven't heard this one. Your father had started to tell Dr. Srivastava about a spy, but died before he could finish speaking. Mahabir shook his head. I had no idea, and I cannot imagine what my father could possibly have had to do with a spy. I had just finished my drink and twisted the straw when I noticed a tall and hefty man having tea at the next table, staring at us. He rose and came forward as he caught my eye. Namaskar, he said to Feluda. Hope you remember me. Yes, of course. I hadn't recognized him at first, but now I could. We had seen this man in Bonobihari Babu's house. He was supposed to be in charge of the zoo. Today, he had a piece of cotton stuck on his chin, held in place by 2 strips of sticking plaster. Perhaps he had cut himself while shaving. Do sit down, Feluda invited. Meet Mahabir Seth. This is Ganesh Guha. Now I noticed a scratch on his neck, although it was clearly an old one. What happened to your chin? Asked Feluda. Ganesh Babu picked up his cup from the next table and joined us. Don't remind me. He winced. I'm surprised my whole body hasn't been torn apart. You know about my job, don't you? Yes, but I thought it was a job you'd taken on willingly. You're joking. I do it because I have to, simply for the money. I was once the keeper of a tiger in a circus, but that tiger was drugged most of the time. I tell you, compared to the animals I handle in Bonobihari Babu's zoo, the tiger was little more than a baby. The wildcat clawed me the other day, and now the hyena slaps me on the chin. I couldn't take it any more, so I told Mr. Sarkar this morning I had made up my mind. I want to go back to that circus. He agreed to let me go. What? Feluda sounded surprised. You have given up your job? Why? We were at your zoo only yesterday. Yes, I know, and no doubt many other people would like to go and visit my zoo. But I'm clearing out. I'll go straight to the station from here and buy myself a ticket to Howrah. Then I'll soon be home, away from it all. The thing is, he stooped and spoke into Feluda's ear, that man is not as straightforward as he might seem. You mean Bonobihari Babu? He was all right, I guess, until he laid his hands on something. Then he lost his head. What thing? No, I've already said too much. Ganesh Guha dropped a few coins on the next table and disappeared. Feluda turned to Mahabir and said, Have you ever seen Bonobihari Babu's zoo? No, I would have liked to have seen it, but my father was dead against the idea. He hated the kind of animals that zoo is reported to be filled with. In fact, the sight of a cockroach would have given him palpitations. But now, yes, I think I'll go and see it. Mahabir snapped his fingers at a waiter. Feluda had already offered to pay, but Mahabir would not let him. Well, I thought to myself, a film actor was supposed to make a lot of money, so paying for a cup of tea and a cold drink couldn't hurt him much. After paying the bill, he took out a packet of cigarettes and offered it to Feluda. I noticed they were Charminars. How long are you here for? He asked. Tomorrow we are going to Haridwar for a couple of days, but after that we are here until next month. Are you all going to Haridwar? No, Dhiru Kaka cannot get away, so we three are going, and possibly Bono Bihari Babu. He is going to look for a python in Lakshman Jhula. We went out of the restaurant. I have a car, Mahabir offered. I could give you a lift. No thanks, said Feluda. We can ride in a motor car any time in Calcutta. A Tonga is a new experience, and an enjoyable one. Mahabir took Feluda's hand and clasped it warmly. It really was a pleasure to meet you, he said. Let me tell you just one thing. If I get evidence that my father did not die a natural death, and that someone was responsible for it, I will not rest until I have tracked down the criminal and settled scores with him. I may be young, but I did spend 4 years in the military academy. I have a licensed revolver, and I am a crack shot. Goodbye. He crossed the road, got into his black Standard, and drove off. Feluda simply said, Bravo! Yes, the plot had certainly thickened. There appeared to be a puzzle within a puzzle, a maze within a maze. We began walking in search of a Tonga. Feluda didn't really need blades, I realized. Chapter 7. We had to take the Doon Express to get to Haridwar. It left Lucknow in the evening and reached Haridwar at 4:30 a.m. When Baba had mentioned a possible visit to Haridwar before we left Calcutta, I had been pleased. Puri was the only holy place I had seen, so the thought of seeing another was quite exciting. But now, after all this hullabaloo over the stolen ring, I did not feel like leaving Lucknow. Feluda, however, had not lost his enthusiasm. You'll see how interesting it is to go from Haridwar to Rishikesh and then to Lakshman Jhula. The river is different in each place. The further north you go, the stronger it gets. In Lakshman Jhula, it gushes with such powerful turbulence that it's practically impossible to have a conversation by its side. Have you been to all these places? Yes, I went to all 3 after my last visit to Lucknow. Dhiru Kaka himself drove us to the station. Almost as soon as we had moved into our coach with our baggage, Dr. Srivastava turned up. Nice of him to have come to see us off. But no, a coolie was carrying his suitcase. We stared at him. I had asked Dhiru Babu not to tell. Dr. Srivastava laughed, as the coolie put the suitcase down. He knew I wanted to go with you. Gave you a surprise, didn't I? Baba seemed very pleased. Good, he said. I didn't think you'd be able to come away, or I would have asked you myself. Srivastava dusted one corner of his seat and sat down. To tell you the truth, he said, I have tried not to show it, but I have been upset by the loss of Pyarilal's gift. So I thought, getting away from it all might do me some good. Bono Bihari Babu arrived within 5 minutes, with rather a lot of luggage. He greeted everyone with a smile and said, Stand by now for a spectacular event. Pavitrananda Swami is travelling in this train. His followers are coming to bid him farewell. Witness their devotion. A plump, saffron-clad figure arrived a little later, long hair flowing down his shoulders. He was accompanied by dozens of people with garlands in their hands. He got into the first-class coach next to ours. A few others crowded round the doorway. Presumably, all these were his devotees. There were just 5 minutes left before the train's departure. We had all climbed into our own carriage. Dhiru Kaka was standing on the platform, chatting with Baba through an open window, when one of the men in saffron detached himself from the group and came walking towards Dhiru Kaka, a big smile on his face, his arm outstretched. Dhiru? Do you remember me? Dhiru Kaka stared dumbly for a few seconds. then with a shout of joy strode forward and nearly hugged the other man. "Ambika! Is it really you? Goodness! Why are you wearing these clothes?" "Why, I have been in Saffron now for 7 years." Dhirukaka introduced him. "Ambika and I were classmates in school. We last met each other about 15 years ago." The guard blew his whistle. The wheels creaked into motion, and we heard Ambika Babu tell his friend, "I went to your house the other day. You weren't in, so I waited for nearly half an hour. Didn't your bearer tell you?" We couldn't hear what Dhirukaka said in reply, for the train had gathered speed. Amazed, I looked first at Feluda and then at Baba. Feluda's brows were knitted in a deep frown. "Very strange," Baba said. "Had you been suspecting that gentleman of having stolen the ring?" asked Bonabihari Babu. "Yes, but obviously that must now be ruled out. But then, who took the ring? Where did it go?" The train clanked out of the platform. I stared with unseeing eyes at the minarets on top of the station. They were beautiful, but I was in no mood to admire them. All my thoughts were confused. What was Feluda thinking? Was he feeling a little embarrassed? After all, he had run all the way to the station to trace the Sadhu Baba. But if the man we just saw talking with Dhirukaka was a perfectly genuine sannyasi, who was that other man with an attache case? Had he been loitering outside Dhirukaka's house the same evening? If so, was it because he knew about the ring, or was there a different reason? And who had thrown that piece of paper at Feluda with "Watch out" written on it? Was Feluda asking himself the same questions? I looked at him again and found him deeply engrossed in reading his blue notebook with the Greek scribbles, and occasionally making further notes. Bonabihari Babu suddenly turned to Dr. Srivastava and asked, "Tell me, doctor, were you the last person to see Pyarelal alive?" Dr. Srivastava was in the process of taking out oranges from a bag. "Yes," he replied, offering them to everyone. "I was certainly by his bedside when he died. So were his widowed sister, his bearer, and another servant." Bonabihari Babu said gravely. "Were you informed after he suffered the attack?" "Yes." "Do you treat ailments of the heart as well?" "There is no reason why an osteopath cannot look at a heart patient, if need be. Besides, his own doctor, Dr. Graham, was out of town that day. So they called me." "Who did?" "His bearer." "Bearer?" Bonabihari Babu raised his eyebrows. "Yes, Pritham Singh. He has been with the family for years. A very sensible and trustworthy man." Bonabihari Babu took the pipe out of his mouth and popped a piece of orange into it. "You told us Pyarelal gave you that ring after his first attack. When he had his second, you were called, but he died." "Yes, that's right. Was anyone else present in the room when you were given that ring?" "How could that be, Bonabihari Babu? One doesn't give away precious and valuable things in front of an audience. Besides, you know what kind of a man Pyarelal was. He would never have wanted to publicize a noble deed. Do you know how many charities he supported secretly? He donated very heavily to hospitals and orphanages. Yet it was never reported in the press. He wouldn't allow it." Srivastava stared at Bonabihari Babu. "Do you have reservations about what I've just said?" he asked. "The thing is, you see," said Bonabihari Babu, "I do think it would have been sensible if you had got someone to witness the event. Such a valuable object changed hands, and yet no one can testify." Srivastava was still staring, speechless. Then he burst out laughing. "Tremendous!" he exclaimed. "This really takes the cake. What you're implying is that I stole the ring from Pyarelal, then I gave it to Dhirubabu, and then I went along and stole it back. Wonderful!" The expression on Bonobihari Babu's face did not change. "You acted sensibly," he said coolly. "I would have done the same. You took the ring over to Dhirubabu to keep it safe from the burglar who had broken into your house. Then you took it back and thought the burglars wouldn't attack your house again. Tell me, Felubabu, I am not too bad at detection, am I?" Felu shut his notebook and began peeling an orange. "Surely," he asked, "there are plenty of witnesses to testify that Dr. Srivastava did indeed save Mahabir's life." "Yes, there probably are," Bonobihari Babu had to admit. "In that case, it is my belief that no matter how valuable the ring was, its value could have not been more than that of a child's life. If Dr. Srivastava did steal that ring, he is certainly an offender, but those who are now after it are real criminals, and dangerous ones at that." "I see," Bonobihari Babu said gravely. "You don't believe that Srivastava has still got the ring, do you?" "No, I don't, because I have evidence to the contrary." Everyone in the coach was silent. I stared at Feluda. Bonobihari Babu was the first to speak. "May I ask what evidence it is?" "Yes, you certainly may, but you won't get an answer, for the right time to discuss it hasn't yet come." I had never heard Feluda speak with such authority. Bonobihari Babu spoke again, with a hint of sarcasm in his voice. "Let's hope I live to see the day." "It shouldn't take long," Feluda said. "There is only one matter of the spy to be cleared up." "Spy?" asked Bonobihari Babu, surprised. "What spy?" Dr. Srivastava spoke this time. I think Felu Babu is referring to Pyarilal's last words. Just before he died, he did say the word spy. In fact, he said it twice. Bonobihari Babu's frown went deeper. Strange. A spy in Lucknow. Then, pipe in hand, he stared at the floor. Yes, it could be. I did suspect, he muttered. What? No, never mind. I may be wrong. Clearly, he did not wish to talk about it. In any case, we had reached Hardoi, so our conversation came to a halt. A cup of tea might be a good idea, said Feluda, and went down onto the platform. I joined him, for I couldn't see the point in sitting inside a train when it was standing at a station. Just as I climbed down from our coach, another man in saffron clothes turned up from somewhere and got in. This is reserved, said Bonobihari Babu quickly. There is no room. Please, sir, pleaded the man, allow me to travel up to Bareilly. Then I'll go elsewhere. I won't disturb you at night. Rather reluctantly, Bonobihari Babu made room for him to sit. These sannyasis will drive me mad, said Feluda, waving at the chaiwala. The man with the tea came running. Would you like some? Yes, why not? Feluda asked the others, but they all declined. I was soon handed an earthen pot filled with hot, steaming tea. I shifted it from one hand to the other, waiting for it to cool, and said, If Dr. Srivastava turns out to be the thief, I shall be very upset. Why? Feluda asked, casually sipping the hot tea. Because I like him. He seems such a nice man. You're a fathead. Haven't you read Woodenitz? The person who appears to be the least suspicious always turns out to be the culprit. But that is not a story. So what? Don't writers base their stories on what they see in real life? This annoyed me very much. In that case, I asked, when Dr. Srivastava came to our house with the ring, who was watching him from the gate and smoking a charminar? That might have been the burglar, or his accomplice. You mean to say, Srivastava is a criminal, and so are the burglars, which would make everyone a villain, because Ganesh Guha said Bonabihari Babu wasn't simple, either. Feluda took another sip, but before he could reply, another screwed-up piece of paper came flying, hit him on the forehead, and fell into his earthen pot. Feluda retrieved it instantly, scanned it, and glanced at the crowd on the platform. Then we heard the guard's whistle. There was no time now to look for the person who threw it. Before getting back to our compartment, Feluda looked once more at what was written on the paper and showed it to me, before screwing it up again and throwing it away on the track. It said, "Watch out," and the words were written with the same red juice of a pawn. The thrilling and mysterious affair of the Emperor's ring had not been left behind in Lucknow at all. It was travelling with us. Chapter 8. It was getting dark. The lights in the train had just come on. We were speeding on our way to Bareilly. There were 7 people in all. Feluda and I had one berth. Baba and Srivastava had another, and on the third sat Bonabihari Babu and the sannyasi. Bonabihari Babu had placed a large trunk and a wooden packing crate on the bunk over the berth Baba and Srivastava were sharing. A stranger was sleeping in the berth over mine. He was all wrapped up in a sheet. All I could see were his toes. He had not stirred since we left Lucknow. I looked around. Bonabihari Babu was sitting cross-legged, smoking his pipe. Srivastava was reading the Gitanjali, and Baba looked as though he was trying very hard to keep awake. He kept rubbing his eyes as he tried to sit up straight. The sannyasi didn't seem interested in us at all. He was turning the pages of a Hindi newspaper. Feluda was singing a song in Urdu, tapping his feet to the rhythm of the wheels. Jab chhod chale Lucknow nagari, kahe haal ke hum par kya guzri. He hummed the rest of it. I could tell he didn't know the words beyond the first 2 lines. Bonabihari Babu spoke unexpectedly. How do you happen to know this song of Wajid Ali Shah? An uncle of mine used to sing it, Feluda replied. He was a very talented Tumri singer. Bonabihari Babu inhaled deeply, stared out at the red western sky, and said, Nawab Wajid Ali Shah was an amazing man. He was both a singer and a composer. He composed the first Indian opera, very much in the style of Western operas. But he was not a warrior. So the British took Lucknow, and the Nawab left for Bengal. His last days were spent in Matiaburuz, where all the Muslim tailors of Calcutta now live. What was most interesting was that Wajid Ali got together with Rajin Malik, who was well known for his wealth, and planned the first zoo in Calcutta. He rose to his feet and opened his trunk. Then he took out a tape recorder. "Allow me to play some of my favorite music," he said. He lifted the top of and pressed a key. Something inside the recorder began whirring. "If you really wish to enjoy this music, look out of the window." I did. In the quickly gathering dusk, I saw a whole jungle rush past our window, and from its depths came the harsh cry of a wild cat, or so it seemed. "I have kept the volume low," said Bonabihari Babu, so it would seem as though the sound was coming from afar. The cat was followed by the hyena. It was fascinating. The train was tearing through a jungle, and it seemed as though the hyena's laugh was coming from outside, echoing through the trees. Then came a different sound. Kirr, kit kit, kirr, kit kit. My heart beat faster. Even the sannyasi had sat up and was listening intently. Rattlesnake, Bonabihari Babu explained. That noise might frighten you, but the snake makes it simply to let the other animals know of its existence, so that it doesn't get trampled on. You mean it wouldn't normally attack man? Baba asked. No, not normally, but then, nor would any other snake. But if it was cornered or provoked, most certainly it would turn aggressive. For instance, if it was held captive in a small room and you happened to be in it, I'd say your chances of being attacked would be pretty strong. There is one other thing. These snakes can see in the dark. He switched the recorder off and said, Unfortunately, the other inmates of my zoo are not represented here. Two of them, the spider and the scorpion, are of course totally silent. Now if I get that python, I'm going to record its hiss. It felt weird to hear those sounds, said Baba. Yes, it must have done. But it's different for me, you see. What you have heard, to my ears, is sweeter than music. Since I cannot take my animals with me when I travel, I carry their voices, so to speak. The train pulled in at Bareilly. A waiter came in with our dinner, and the sannyasi left. Having finished what was on his own plate, Feluda coolly helped himself to a leg of chicken from mine. Chicken is good for the brain when it's being exercised so much, he said by way of explanation. I see. And am I not exercising my brain? No. For you, the whole thing's no more than a game. So where have you got to, with all your brain power? Feluda lowered his voice, so that only I could hear what he said. I have got an idea which spy Pyarelal had tried to talk about. He refused to say any more. The train left Bareilly. We have to get up at 4 in the morning, said Baba. It's time for bed, I think. Bonabihari Babu switched the lights off. I shan't sleep, he said, but rest assured I'll wake you before we get to Haridwar. I stretched out on one half of our berth, leaving the other for Feluda. Looking out of the window, I could see the moon. It seemed to be travelling with us. What were we going to do in Haridwar? The moon, for some odd reason, made me think. There was plenty to see in Haridwar, I knew. But if we came away simply after a look at the Ganges and the temples, it would all be rather tame. Something had to happen. I wanted something exciting to happen. The train was making such a racket. How could anyone sleep in this? But of course, people did. It was strange. If, at home, there was a constant clanking noise and someone kept shaking my bed, would I ever be able to sleep a wink? I had to ask Feluda. If a particular noise goes on for a long time, he replied, the ears get used to it. So after a point, it doesn't disturb. And the rocking actually helps one to sleep. Haven't you seen babies being rocked to sleep? As a matter of fact, if the noise or the movement stopped, you would wake instantly. Which is why, very often, one wakes when a train stops at a station. Feluda was right. Soon, my eyes grew heavy with sleep and I began to see things. For a minute, I thought the man who was sleeping on the upper berth climbed down and moved around in the compartment. Then I heard a laugh. It could have been a man or a hyena, but there was no time to think, for I was lost in Bulbulaya, going crazy trying to find my way out. Each time I turned a corner, there was a huge spider blocking my way and staring at me through green, luminescent eyes. Then it lifted one of its large hairy legs and laid it on my shoulder. At that moment, I opened my eyes and found Feluda shaking me by the shoulder. "Get up, Topshe. Here is Haridwar." Chapter 9. Panda? Would you like a panda? May I have your name, Babu? Where are you from? This way, Babu. Which dharamshala are you booked at? You will go to the temple of Baba Daksheshwar, won't you? I had no idea the group of pandas waiting on the platform would surround us like this, even though Feluda had warned me of the possibility. These pandas apparently kept huge ledgers that held records of one's ancestors, those who had visited Haridwar, that is, going back several hundred years. My great-great-grandfather was supposed to have left home to become a sannyasi. He had spent a long time in Haridwar. Perhaps one of those ledgers contained his name and address, or maybe even his handwriting. Who could tell? "There is no need for a panda," said Bonobihari Babu. "That would only add to the confusion. Let's go to Sheetal Das's dharamshala. I know the place. We could be together, and the food's not too bad. It's just a matter of one night anyway. Tomorrow we leave for Rishikesh and Lakshmanjula." A coolie picked up our luggage. We came out of the station and hired 3 tongas. Feluda and I got into one, Baba and Dr. Srivastava got into another, and Bonobihari Babu took the third. It was still dark. "A holy place," said Feluda, "is always dirty. But once you're by the river, it feels quite pleasant." Our tonga rattled along the lanes of Haridwar. Not a single shop was open yet. There were men sleeping on string beds by the roadside wrapped in blankets. Kerosene lamps flickered here and there. A few old men went past, metal pots in hand. They were going to the river, Feluda explained. They would stand immersed in waist-deep water and wait for sunrise, chanting hymns to welcome a new day. The rest of the town was still asleep. Bonobihari Babu's tonga was leading us. It stopped in front of a white single-storied house with large pillars. This, clearly, was Sheetal Das's dharamshala. There was a courtyard as we went in through the gate. Corridors ran round its sides, and the rooms stood in neat rows. A man from the dharamshala came out and took our luggage in. We were about to follow him through a door when another tonga came and stopped at the front gate. The sadhu who had travelled with us up to Bareilly climbed down from it. I tugged at Feluda's sleeve. "Look, it's the same man, the one in the train." Feluda gave the man a sidelong glance and said, "Do you mean to say even this man is a suspect?" "Well, this is the second time—" "Shh! Not a word. Let's go in." Baba, Feluda and I were given one room. There were 4 beds in it. The occupant of the 4th bed was fast asleep. Bonobihari Babu and Dr. Srivastava were given the room next to ours. The sadhu joined them. By the time all of us had had a wash and tea had been ordered, it was fairly bright. A number of people were now awake, and the whole place had become quite noisy. I now realized what a wide variety of people were staying at the dharamshala. There were Bengalis, Marwaris, people from Uttar Pradesh, Gujaratis, Maharashtrians, all contributing equally to the general cacophony. "Are you thinking of going out?" asked Baba. "Yes, I'd like to go to the river," Feluda said. "All right. I'm going with Bonobihari Babu to arrange for 2 taxis for tomorrow. And if you're going anywhere near a market, get an ever-ready torch. After all, this is not a place like Lucknow. A torch may come in handy." We left. Feluda said the place was too small for a tonga ride. It was better to walk. I soon began to feel the difference in temperature. Haridwar was definitely cooler than Lucknow, and, possibly because it was so close to a river, covered by a misty haze. "It's more smoke than mist," Feluda said. "The smoke comes from Angitis." We stopped to ask our way a little later. "Half a mile from here," we were told. A different cacophony greeted us from a distance, even before we reached the river. It turned out to be groups of bathers. Besides, hawkers and beggars lined the path running to the river bank, and they were no less noisy. We pushed through the crowd and made our way to the steps that led to the edge of the water. The scene that met my eyes was one I have never witnessed since. It was as though a carnival was being held by the riverside. Bells pealed within a temple that stood by the steps. A Vaishnav sat singing a bhajan near the temple, surrounded by a group of old men and women. Cows, goats, dogs, and cats moved about freely, in happy conjunction with the humans. Feluda found a relatively quiet spot on the steps, and we sat down. "If you want a glimpse of ancient India," he said, "just watch the scene below." The whole thing was so different from Lucknow that I nearly forgot the stolen ring. Did Feluda feel the same way, or was his mind still working on the case? I looked at Feluda, but didn't dare ask him. He was taking out his cigarettes and a matchbox from his pocket with a contented air. This was clearly good opportunity to have a smoke, since he couldn't when Baba was present. He put a cigarette between his lips and pushed open the matchbox. Something flashed brightly. Startled, I asked, "What was that, Feluda?" By then, he had shut the box again. "What was what?" he asked, apparently taken aback. "That. Object that's in your matchbox. I saw it flash." Feluda cupped his mouth with both hands to light his cigarette and inhaled. Then he blew the smoke out and said, "Matchsticks have phosphorus in them, don't you know? That's what flashed in the sun." I couldn't ask anything further, but that seemed an unlikely story. Matchsticks didn't glitter in the sun. We stayed by the river a little longer, and then went to see the temple of Daksheshwar. By the time we were out of the temple, buying a torch in a stationery shop, it was nearly 10:30. But no matter what we did or saw, I simply could not get the matchbox out of my mind. Somehow, I felt convinced what I had seen shining in the sun was the diamond in Aurangzeb's ring. If Feluda had said it was a coin, I might have believed him. But his tale of phosphorus in matchsticks was pure nonsense, and I knew it. But what if it was the ring? Did the burglars know Feluda had it with him? Was that why they were threatening him and trying to hurt him? Why, they had even tried to chloroform us. Feluda, however, appeared quite unperturbed. He was humming quietly. "There is a raga called Khat." He stopped at one point to explain. "It has to be sung in the morning. What I am humming is the same raga." I wanted to say, "Keep your ragas to yourself. I'm not interested, and, in fact, I'm very cross with you. Why did you tell me a lie?" But I couldn't utter these words, for we had reached the dharamshala. I decided to tackle Feluda on the subject in the evening. Baba, Bonobihari Babu, and Dr. Srivastava were sitting on the veranda, talking to another gentleman, who was wearing a dhoti and kurta and appeared to be another Bengali. "We have arranged a couple of taxis," Baba said upon our arrival, "and we are leaving tomorrow morning at 6. Bonobihari Babu knew those fellows, so we have been given a concession. The Bengali gentleman, called Bilash Babu, was from Allahabad. He turned out to be a palmist. Bonobihari Babu offered his palm and asked, "Is there any chance of my being bitten to death by an animal?" Bilash Babu ran a glove on the lines of Bonobihari Babu's hand and said, "Why, no, it looks like a natural death to me." My eyes fell on the palmist's feet. They were distinctly odd. The big toe on each foot was longer than the others by at least half an inch. I could have sworn I had seen these feet, or feet like these, quite recently. But where might that have been? I simply couldn't remember. Bonobihari Babu gave a sigh of relief. "Thank goodness," he said. "Why do you say that? Are you a shikari? Do you go tiger hunting, or what?" Bilash Babu seemed puzzled. No, Bonobihari Babu replied, "but it's just as well to make sure. A cousin of mine once got bitten by a mad dog. You know, purely out of the blue. The poor chap died of hydrophobia. So I thought..." "Did you used to live in Calcutta?" "Good heavens! Is even that written in my hand?" "Yes, so it would seem. And are you interested in collecting antiques?" "Antiques? Who, me? Oh no, it was Pyarelal who did that. I'm interested in animals." "Are you? Is that why you were talking about getting bitten?" But what?" Bonobihari Babu asked eagerly. "Have you recently been under stress?" "How recently?" "Say in the last 30 days? Bonobihari Babu laughed. "No, sir. I have not a care in the world, and I haven't been worried. My only anxiety is about whether I shall find that python tomorrow in Lakshman Jhula." Bilash Babu looked as though he would have liked to have peered at his palms a little longer, but Bonobihari Babu withdrew them abruptly and yawned. "The truth is," he said, "I don't really believe in palmistry. Please don't mind my saying this, but I don't think what we make of ourselves has anything to do with the lines on our hands. The only thing I believe in is man's own strength and his ability to succeed." So saying, he rose and went into his room. My eyes went once more to Bilash Babu's feet. But no, I still could not recall where I had seen them. Chapter 10. I didn't get the chance at all that day to speak to Feluda about his dazzling matchbox. Baba wanted us to go to bed early, since we had to be up at the crack of dawn the following morning. But by the time we finished dinner and were able to go bed, it was past 10 p.m. As I got into bed, I could hear someone snore very loudly through the communicating door between our room and the next. "Bilash Babu," said Feluda briefly. "How do you know?" "Why, he was snoring in the train yesterday. Didn't you hear him? In the train?" "Was Bilash Babu in the train with us?" "Of course." One little piece of the jigsaw puzzle fell into place. "Those big toes!" Feluda gently patted my shoulder. "Good," he said. Yes, that was right. Bilash Babu was the man who had lain on the upper berth, wrapped in a sheet from head to toe. But I had seen his toes. It was now time to ask Feluda the question that had been bothering me all day. But I had to wait until Baba was asleep. I could tell by his movements that he was still awake. The dharamshala was gradually falling silent, as was the whole town. It was the beginning of winter, so people would, in any case, retire early. It was dark inside our room, but a light from the courtyard outside fell on the threshold. What was that noise under the bed? A rat or a mouse, probably. Baba was now asleep. I could hear his deep, regular breathing. Turning to Feluda, I whispered, "It was the ring, wasn't it?" Feluda said nothing for a few moments. Then he sighed and whispered back, "All right. Since you have guessed it already, there's no point in hiding things from you. I have had the ring from the very first day. When all of you, including Thiru Kaka, had gone to sleep, I saw that his trousers were hanging from a rack. I knew the keys of his almirah were in one of his pockets. So I took them out, opened the almirah, and removed the ring. I didn't take the box deliberately, so that there would be no doubt that only the ring had gone." "But why?" "Because I knew that would only provoke the real thief, and then it would be easier to catch him." "Does it mean that the sannyasi had turned up simply to steal the ring?" "Yes, but it wasn't Ambika Babu. It was the other fake one, who had an attaché case in his hand. He must have had the shock of his life when he saw another sannyasi in the living room. I bet that's when he went to the station and changed his clothes." "Who is this fake sannyasi?" "I have my suspicions, but not enough evidence. Yet." "You mean you've been carrying that ring in your pocket all these days?" "No." "What did you do then?" "I kept it in a safe place." "Where?" "In the bulbulaya, in one of those little niches." Good God, what a clever mind! Now I could see why he had disappeared in that maze for a few minutes. "But how could you have gone back to find it? You didn't know how the maze had been built? I mean, its plan." "I had made an arrangement for that. You may have noticed that the little finger of my left hand has a long nail. I had scratched numbers with it on the walls of those passages. The ring was in the 7th passage. I went back before leaving Lucknow and took it out. I didn't like the idea of the ring lying there while I went out of town." My heartbeat grew faster again. "What if those burglars suspect that you have got the ring?" "So what? They couldn't prove it. Anyway, I don't think they're clever enough to guess where the ring is." "Is that the case, why they're threatening you?" "Why are they threatening you?" "Because they haven't given up hopes of getting hold of it. And they know very well that I'm capable of ruining all their plans." "But..." My throat was so badly parched I could hardly speak. "You might be in great danger." Felumittir thrives on risks and danger. "But..." "No more buts. Go and sleep." Feluda yawned and turned to his side. The dharamshala was now totally quiet. A dog barked somewhere. The snoring in the next room continued non-stop. I could not get the matchbox and its content out of my mind. One had to marvel at the courage Feluda had shown. If it wasn't for what he had done, the ring would have been stolen and the thief would have got away with it. Grrr, kit kit kit. Grrr, kit kit kit. From the next room came the faint noise of the rattlesnake, but it sounded as though it was coming from a distance. Bonobihari Babu must be listening to his favorite music. Strangely enough, this funny noise soon soothed me to sleep. Baba had set the alarm on his travelling clock for 5 a.m. I woke a little before it went off. It did not take us long to get ready after a cup of tea. "We needn't worry about taking food," said Dr. Srivastava. "There are shops at the foot of the bridge in Laxmanjula that sell very good puri sabzi." We were all wearing our woolens. Lakshmanjula was further up in the hills and was bound to be cooler. The 2 taxis arrived at 5:45 and stopped by the front gate. Bilash Babu came out and joined us. It turned out that he too was going to Lakshmanjula and would travel with us. As I stood debating on which car to get into, Bonabihari Babu said, 3 in each car, obviously. I could tell you some interesting stories about animals, Tapesh. Would you like to join me? Yes, why not? I'm sure Feluda would like to come along too. Feluda didn't seem to mind. So Bonabihari Babu, Feluda and I got into one taxi, and Baba got into the other with Dr. Srivastava and Bilash Babu, who seemed to have struck up a friendship already. Bonabihari Babu placed the wooden packing crate on the front seat beside the driver. For my python, if I can find it, he said. Feluda sat in the middle in the back seat. I sat on his left, and Bonabihari Babu went over to his right. Both cars left at 6:15. 5 minutes later, we were out of the main town and into the open countryside. The hills rose before us. If I looked out of the right window, I could catch an occasional glimpse of the Ganges. My heart suddenly felt light. Bonabihari Babu too appeared to be in a good mood, for he was humming under his breath, possibly at the thought of his python. Feluda, however, did not utter a word. What was he thinking? Was the ring still in that matchbox in his pocket? There was no way of telling, for I knew he wouldn't smoke before Bonabihari Babu. The other taxi was right in front of us. I could see Bilash Babu talking to Dr. Srivastava. Perhaps the latter has seized this opportunity to have his palm read. The roads aren't dusty because of the early morning dew, said Bonabihari Babu. But very soon you will see that other car throw up clouds of dust. I think we ought to let them go ahead. Driver, will you please slow down a bit? The bearded Sikh driver reduced the speed of our taxi, and the distance between Baba's car and ours grew considerably. I had wanted both cars to travel together. Never mind about the dust. But I didn't dare say anything to Bonabihari Babu. When would he start on his stories? There was a car behind ours, apparently in a hurry to overtake us. Annoyed by its honking, Bonabihari Babu said to the driver, "This will drive me mad. Let it go, driver. Give way." The driver very obediently moved a little to the left, and an old-fashioned Chevrolet taxi shot past us. Its passenger leant out of the window and gave us a quick look. I recognized him instantly. It was the sannyasi from the train. Chapter 11. It had already been decided that we would first go to Lakshmanjula, spend most of the day there, and stop at Rishikesh on our way back. To tell the truth, I wasn't too keen on going to Rishikesh, which I knew would be crowded and dirty like any other holy place. Only the river was likely to be a little different. Bonabihari Babu was now singing the same Urdu song Feluda had been singing in the train. Jab chor chale Lucknow Nagri, kahe haal ke hum pe kya guzri. He stopped abruptly and asked, "Have you heard of Jim Corbett?" "Yes." He killed man-eaters in these valleys, but like me, he understood animals and loved them. I have always admired him for that. Bonabihari Babu started singing again. Our car sped towards Lakshmanjula through the hills. On our right, the river occasionally showed itself through stretches of dense jungle. The sky was clouding over. The breeze seemed to grow cooler each time the sun got blocked out by a cloud. I began to think about the stolen ring again. I had learned quite a few things in the last few days, but there was such a lot that still remained unexplained. Why did Mahabir think Pyarilal's death had not been a natural one? Why had Pyarilal screamed? Which spy had he tried to talk about? Was it someone we knew, or was it an outsider? All these thoughts chased one another in my mind as I glanced about idly. My eyes suddenly fell on the rear-view mirror. I saw Feluda in it, looking intently in front of him. I turned my head. He was staring at the driver. My eyes turned automatically in the same direction. Then my heart seemed to stand still. On the driver's neck, between his turban and shirt collar, was a long scratch. We had seen someone recently with an identical mark. It had been Ganesh Guha. I looked at Feluda again. He was now gazing out of the window. I had never seen him look so grim. Sitting with us in the quality restaurant, Ganesh Guha had said he had left his job and was leaving for Calcutta the same day. Today he was dressed like a Sikh and taking us to Lakshman Jhula. What could it mean? Then it occurred to me that this taxi had been arranged by Bonobihari Babu himself. Oh God! In that case... I could think no more. My head began to reel. Where were we going? Was it Lakshman Jhula, or was it somewhere else? What did Bonobihari Babu intend to do? He appeared calm enough and certainly did not look as though he had any ill intent. At this point, he startled me by speaking abruptly. We shall now turn left. There is a path that goes through the jungle. Then we'll come to a house where I expect to find the python. Let's just have a look now. Then we can collect it on our way back. All right, Felu Babu? Yes, fine, said Feluda with remarkable composure. But I couldn't help ask, didn't you say the python was in Lakshman Jhula? Bonobihari Babu burst out laughing. And who, he asked, told you this is not Lakshman Jhula? Howrah doesn't simply mean the Howrah Bridge, does it? It means a whole region. Lakshman Jhula begins from here. The bridge over the Ganges is more than a mile from here. Our car took a left turn into the jungle. The path, covered with overgrown wild bushes, was virtually invisible. I noticed that the driver didn't even wait for instructions. He drove as though he knew where he was going. How do you find this place, Felu Babu? Bonobihari Babu asked. His voice sounded different. There appeared to be a suppressed excitement behind those simple words. Beautiful, said Feluda, and gently pressed my right hand with his left. I knew it was his way of saying, Don't be afraid, I'm here. Have you brought a handkerchief, Topshe? asked Feluda. I wasn't prepared for such a question at all, so I could only stammer. Handkerchief? Don't you know what it is? Yes, of course, but I forgot to bring one. Bonobihari Babu said, Are you worried about the dust? It's not going to be all that dusty in here. No, it's not the dust, Feluda replied and stuffed a handkerchief into my pocket. I totally failed to see why he did this. Bonobihari Babu's tape recorder was lying on his lap. Now he switched it on. A hyena started laughing amongst the trees. The jungle was getting denser and darker. In any case, the sun was probably hiding behind clouds. I wondered where Baba's car might be. Could they have reached Lakshman Jhula already? If anything happened to us, they wouldn't even get to know. Was that why Bonobihari Babu had allowed them to go ahead? I tried to muster all my courage. Although I had every faith in Feluda, Something told me every bit of his own courage and presence of mind was about to be tested. Our car was now crawling along in deep jungle. Bonobihari Babu had turned the recorder off, nor was he singing himself. All I could hear was a cricket and the crunch of leaves under the wheels. After about 10 minutes, through the tree trunks and other foliage, we saw a house. Who on earth could have built a house in a place like this? Then I remembered an uncle of mine who was a forest officer. He was supposed to live in a house in the middle of a forest, with just tigers and other wild animals for company. Perhaps this was a house like this? As we went closer to the house, I realized it was made of wood and had been built on a raised platform. A wooden staircase went up to the front door. It was clearly very old and certainly didn't look as though anyone lived in it. Our taxi stopped before this house. "I don't think Pandeyji is at home," said Bonobihari Babu. "But let's go in and wait, since we have travelled all this way. He may have stepped out only for a few minutes to gather firewood or something. He lives alone, you see, and has to do everything all by himself. But, like me, he's not afraid of animals. So come in, both of you. You have seen fake sannyasis, haven't you? Now you'll see a perfectly genuine one, and perhaps learn something about how he lives." The three of us got out of the car. I cannot tell how I might have kept my nerve if it wasn't for Feluda's reassuring presence. In fact, his unruffled calm made me wonder if the whole thing wasn't just my imagination. What if the driver was an ordinary Sikh and Bonobihari Babu was telling the truth, and this house did contain a sadhu called Pandeyji who had a 12-foot python? We walked towards the staircase, crunching dry leaves under our feet. Then we climbed up the steps and went in. The room we walked into was not much larger than a railway compartment. There was another door that probably led to a second room, but it appeared to be locked from the other side. There were 2 small windows on the opposite wall, through which we could see the trees. The platform on which the house stood was no higher than a man of medium height. Bonobihari Babu's tape recorder was hanging from his shoulder. He put it down on the floor and said, "You can see how simply he lives." There was a broken table, a bench with an arm missing, and a tin chair. Feluda went across to the bench and sat down. I did the same. Bonobihari Babu started filling his pipe. Then he lit it, put the match out, threw it out of the window, and sat down on the chair, after having tested its strength by pressing its seat. "Ah," he sighed with pleasure and began puffing at his pipe, filling the whole room with smoke. "Well," he said after a while, in a low but clear voice, "Felu Babu, can I have my ring back, please?" Chapter 12. "Your ring?" I could tell that Feluda was quite taken aback by the question. Bonobihari Babu did not reply. He only stared at Feluda, the pipe hanging from one corner of his mouth, a little smile on his lips. The crickets outside were silent. "Besides," Feluda continued, "what makes you think I have got it?" Bonobihari Babu spoke this time. "I had my suspicions throughout. I knew it couldn't have been stolen by an outsider. No one could have simply walked into the house and taken something from Dhiren Babu's bedroom without anyone having seen or heard anything. I found that impossible to believe. But although I suspected you, I didn't have any evidence to prove my theory. Now I do." "And what is that evidence?" Silently, Bonobihari Babu picked up his tape recorder and, placing it once more on his lap, switched it on. It froze my blood to hear what I did. "It was the ring, wasn't it?" spoke my own voice from the machine. "Since you have guessed it already, there is no point in hiding things from you." Bonobihari Babu turned the machine off with a click. "I had left it under your bed last night before you returned to your room," he said. "I couldn't, of course, be sure that you would indeed talk about the ring. But since you did, I couldn't miss such an opportunity to get what I wanted. What better evidence would you need, eh, Felu Babu?" "But how can you claim that the ring is yours?" Bonobihari Babu put the recorder on the table, crossed his legs and leant back in his chair. "In 1948, he said, that is exactly 18 years ago, I bought that ring from the Naulaka Company in Calcutta. It cost me 200,000 rupees. I got to know Pyarilal soon after this. He didn't tell me he was interested in antiques, but I did show him the ring. The look on his face on seeing it made me instantly wary. 2 days later, it disappeared from my house. The police were informed, but they couldn't catch the thief. Then I came to Lucknow, and so did Pyarilal. I learnt that he had had the ring all these years, only when Srivastava showed it to me. I don't suppose Pyarilal thought he would survive his first heart attack. So he got rid of what he had stolen many years ago. But then he recovered, and I went to see him. What I had thought was that, if he admitted to the theft, I could perhaps get the ring back from Srivastava. I'm sure he would have agreed, and I was even prepared to offer him some compensation. But do you know what happened? Pyarilal simply denied the whole thing. In fact, he went so far as to say he had never seen the ring in my house in Calcutta." Feluda broke in at this point, not a trace of fear in his voice. "I would like to ask you something, Bonobihari Babu, and I hope you'll give me an answer." "No. You tell me first if you've got the ring with you now, or have you left it somewhere? I want to recover myself what is my own." "Oh?" said Feluda, speaking with undisguised scorn. "How come then that you didn't hesitate to get other people to steal the ring for you, or even have me followed and threatened? That henchman of yours, Ganesh Guha, isn't it, is dressed like a Sikh taxi driver today. I believe he was the fake sannyasi, wasn't he? You got him to break into Srivastava's house and follow his car the next day. But then he was told to keep an eye on me, throwing stones at me at the residency, trying to chloroform both of us, showering threats on me. All these were his doings, weren't they?" Bonobihari Babu smiled. "One cannot possibly do every little thing oneself, can one? An assistant can be very useful, you know. Besides, Ganesh is strong and healthy and has spent years handling wild animals. So I knew he'd be good at this reckless game. And I have to say this, if he has done anything wrong, it is only because I asked him to. What you have done, Felu Babu, is far worse. You are hanging on to something that doesn't belong to you. It is mine, I tell you, and I want it back. Today, now." He practically shouted the last few words. I was still trying hard to stay calm, but my hands began to feel clammy. Feluda's voice sounded cold as steel when he spoke. "What use will that ring be to you, Bonobihari Babu, when you're charged with murder?" Bonobihari Babu rose from his chair, trembling with rage. "What? What impudence! You don't know what you're saying. How dare you?" "I dare because I believe I see a murderer before me. Now will you tell me a bit more about the spy Pyarilal had mentioned? You appeared to know something about it." Bonobihari Babu smiled dryly and said, There is nothing to explain. It's all quite simple. I had set a few men to follow him round to find more about the ring. I'm sure that's what he meant. And what if I tell you the word spy had nothing to do with your secret service? What do you mean? You went to visit Pyarelal the morning when he had his second attack, didn't you? You saw him before the attack came on. So what? Are you implying that the very sight of me would give him a cardiac arrest? I had visited him often enough, even before that particular day. Yes, but that day you were not empty-handed. Empty-handed? What are you getting at? You went armed with a box. In that box was an inmate of your zoo, that huge, poisonous African spider, the Black Widow. Isn't that right? What Pyarelal had tried to say was spider, but he couldn't complete the word. So a spider became a spy. Bonobihari Babu suddenly went pale. He sat down again. But what could I have gained from showing him the spider? He asked. You were probably unaware that a sight of a cockroach gave him palpitations. Your intention was probably just to frighten him into handing the ring over to you. But the whole thing took a nasty turn, didn't it? Pyarelal's fright caused a heart attack, leading to his death. Now who is responsible for it but you? And you sit there and tell me you had bought the ring in Calcutta. What if I tell you it was Pyarelal who had shown it to you 18 years ago, and ever since then you had wanted to get hold of it? In that room in your house, which you said you always kept locked, there are many more old and valuable objects stashed away, and the purpose of the zoo is to ward off burglars and robbers. Would you deny any of this? May I, Bonobihari Babu said gravely, ask you what else you happen to believe? Yes, you certainly may, Feluda replied, equally gravely. It is my belief that you will never again lay your eyes on the Emperor's ring, and your future will bring you your just deserts. Ganesh? Bonobihari Babu's shout rang through the air like a gunshot. Ganesh Guha entered the room, carrying the packing crate. Bonobihari Babu collected his tape recorder and began backing out of the room. Cover your face, Feluda told me. I did not stop to question why, and did as I was told, using the handkerchief I had been given. Feluda took out another handkerchief from his pocket, and with it, the little tin of tooth powder. Ganesh Guha, by this time, had placed the crate on the floor and lifted its lid. Just as he was about to retrace his steps, Feluda opened the tin in his hand and threw a handful of powder at both Ganesh Guha and Bonobihari Babu. Then he quickly covered his own face. Through my handkerchief, I got the faint smell of a familiar object. Black pepper. It is difficult to describe the effect it had on the other two. Their faces were distorted with pain, which was followed by incessant sneezing and screams of agony. Bonobihari Babu stumbled out of the room, rolled down the stairs, and landed on the ground outside. Ganesh Guha didn't fare any better, but he managed to pull the door shut behind him, thereby blocking our own escape. Now my eyes went to the open crate on the floor. A snake was slowly raising its head from it, making the same terrifying noise I had heard before. Kirr, kit kit kit. Kirr, kit kit kit. I began to feel strangely lightheaded. Unable to move my limbs, I could only feel Feluda help me stand up on the bench before climbing on it himself. I realized for the first time what terror could do to one. My eyes refused to move from the snake. Or it could be that the snake really did have the power to hypnotize. Before my petrified eyes, it slid out of its box, shook its rattle, and seemed to glance around. Then it fixed its gaze on us, and began to move steadily towards our bench, wriggling sideways on the door, making a constant rattling noise. I appeared to be its immediate target. I could feel my vision getting blurred. The snake was coming closer, and all I could do was stand there, rooted to the spot. Then, when it was only about a couple of yards away, it suddenly felt as though the house we were in was struck by lightning. There was a loud explosion, a flash of light, and a smell of gunpowder. And the snake? The head of the snake was crushed and severed from its body. The rattle shook a couple of times and was still. At this point, I passed into oblivion. I regained consciousness to find myself lying on a doori under a tree. My head and forehead felt cold and damp. Clearly, someone had sprinkled water on me. My eyes slowly focused first on Dr. Srivastava and then on Baba. "How do you feel, Tapesh Babu?" said a vaguely familiar voice. Startled, I turned my head and saw Mahabir. But why was he wearing saffron clothes? "I travelled with you up to Bareilly," Mahabir grinned, "and yet you didn't recognize me." He must be a talented actor, and he was wearing excellent makeup. In a long flowing beard, he had truly been unrecognizable. Besides, he had changed both his voice and speech. "Now you have seen how good my aim is. Actually, I began to feel doubtful about Bonobihari Babu the day we met at the Bulbulaya, and he denied ever having seen me before. The truth was that he had often visited our house in Calcutta and spoken to me a number of times. Once he and my father had a row over that ring. I recall that event only a few days ago. When we couldn't spot your car," Baba added, "we reversed ours and followed the tire marks into the jungle. But it was Mahabir's idea." "And what happened to those two?" "They have been adequately punished. Felu's powdered thunder had the most remarkable effect on both. Now they are being looked after by the police." "Police? How did the police get involved?" "Why, they came with us. Vilash Babu is actually Inspector Gargari, you see." "How very strange. Who would have thought that that palmist was really a police inspector? I had no idea the mystery of the Emperor's ring would end like this." "But where was Feluda?" A light flashed in my eyes again. But there was no loud noise this time. I saw Feluda standing at some distance, wearing the ring on his finger. He was turning it around in the sunlight that seeped through the leaves and reflecting the light straight into my eyes. I thought quietly to myself, if anyone had emerged the winner in this whole business, truly like an emperor, it was none other than Feluda.